Hebrew, a hard and ancient doorway, a language that lets a name arrive in the mouth like stone, like iron, like something cut rather than painted. And tonight, we begin there. Not because Hebrew is the whole story, and not because Ge'ez must wait somewhere outside the room, but because the old world of these names reaches us through several layers of memory. Hebrew gives us one sound. Aramaic stands somewhere behind the older shape of the tradition. Greek carried the book across another threshold. And Ge'ez, patient and liturgical, held the full witness long enough for weary people like us to sit beside it now. So tonight, we are opening a dangerous little list. Not just the story that the Watchers fell. Most people know that much. Not just the broad warning that strange beings crossed a forbidden boundary. Many listeners have heard that too. What fewer people have ever been invited to do is this: to sit still enough to hear the names themselves, to feel how carefully the old witness counts them, and to notice that the count does not rest on the page as smoothly as we expect. That is the hidden detail tonight. The old text does not leave these rebels faceless. It counts them. It names them. It remembers that corruption did not descend upon the world as a fog without shape. It came with identity. It came with leadership. It came with instruction. It came, if we listen closely, with a terrifying kind of pedagogy. These beings did not only transgress, they taught. And once the text starts naming teachers, the whole atmosphere changes. You are no longer standing in front of a legend told loosely around a fire. You are sitting before an archive, and on that archive table, there lies a line that many readers pass too quickly. A line that should feel settled, but does not. A line that tells us these leaders were chiefs of tens. A line that gestures toward 20. And then, when many modern readers begin to count the names as they appear in familiar printed forms, they feel a small disturbance, as though one chair at the table remains quietly unfilled. That disturbance is where we begin, because Pastor Michael must say this carefully tonight. The title promise of this study is strong, but the old witness is stronger. If the text gives us certainty, we will receive certainty with gratitude. If the text gives us strain, we will receive strain with humility. We will not smooth the page just to make the night easier. We will not force the archive into a neat modern chart if the manuscript itself refuses to behave so tidily. That, dear listener, is part of the holiness of old study. Sometimes the truth survives in full color. Sometimes it survives in outline. And sometimes it survives with one edge worn thin by many hands. So before we even climb toward Hermon, before we hear the oath, before the names are spoken one by one, let us settle inside the central textual question. If the old Enochic witness speaks of accounted leadership among the Watchers, what exactly has been preserved for us, and what has been preserved unevenly? That question matters because the title is not really about curiosity alone. It is about moral architecture. If certain names remain attached to certain forbidden gifts, then the old text is telling us something chilling about evil. Evil is not only appetite. Evil is instruction. Evil is apprenticeship. Evil is the handing over of techniques before the handing over of wisdom. Evil is knowledge arriving before obedience. Power arriving before holiness. Skill arriving before reverence. This is why the Watchers remain so haunting. Not because they are mysterious in a theatrical way, not because they make the night more dramatic, but because they press on one of the oldest fears in the human story. What if something powerful taught us how to do a thing before teaching us whether we should. And that is why the names matter. A faceless danger can be dismissed as atmosphere. A named danger must be considered. A counted danger must be reckoned with. And a preserved danger, carried across centuries in an ancient witness, must be opened slowly, with the kind of care one uses for a page that has outlived empires. Tonight, we are not rushing to the spectacle of giants. We are not hurrying toward judgment thunder. We are not yet tracing every forbidden art. First, we are listening to the shape of the record itself. Because the page speaks before the story expands, the page tells us that someone in the old tradition believed these leaders should be remembered by name. Someone believed their rebellion was not random enough to be left uncounted. And there is a strange mercy in that. When sin is described only in general terms, the heart can remain vague. But when a text begins to say, this one taught this, and this one stood here, and these were the chiefs, and this was the oath, and this was the mountain, and this was the wound they opened into the human world, then conscience awakens. Then the listener cannot drift entirely into abstraction. Then we begin to understand that the ancient writers were not merely trying to frighten the imagination. They were trying to diagnose corruption with a pastor's seriousness and a scribe's memory. This is one reason the Ethiopic preservation of Enoch matters so deeply tonight. The full text survives for us in gaze, in the old liturgical language of the Ethiopian church. Fragments of the tradition survive elsewhere in Aramaic and in Greek remains, yes, but the complete witness, the whole shape of the book, as received through Christian centuries in Ethiopia, endured because communities carried it, copied it, and read it. That does not mean we handle the text carelessly. It does not mean every line reaches us without questions. It does mean that the old witness remained in living custody long enough for this difficult chamber to stay open. And I confess, there is something deeply moving in that, because difficult texts are often the first ones modern readers want to flatten, skip, sensationalize, or tidy away. But here the witness remains. The names remain. The moral discomfort remains. The unfinished count remains. And this very unfinished feeling may be part of the title's hidden power. If the list felt perfectly polished, we might consume it too quickly. We might turn it into trivia. We might imagine we had mastered it in a single sitting. But an old list that catches in the throat, an old count that seems to hesitate, an old archive that preserves both confidence and strain, that kind of witness makes us slower. And slowness is good for the soul when handling dangerous knowledge. So let the room become narrow now, as though lamplight has drawn closer around one parchment column. Let all the larger conversations wait. We are not yet asking every question. We are only asking the first true one. Who were these leaders, exactly? How many stood at the head of the rebellion? And why does the old text sound as though it wants to hand us a complete count, while the surviving line, as many of us receive it in translation, leaves us with the strange sensation that one name is missing from the row? That is where tonight's archive opens. Not with atmosphere only, not with comfort only, but with a line, a counted line, a troubled line, a line preserved across languages and centuries, now asking to be read with both wonder and restraint. And if we read it rightly, it may change the way we hear the whole Watcher's story. Because once the rebellion becomes a list, and once the list begins to show strain, we realize we are not merely listening to myth. We are listening to transmission. We are listening to memory under pressure. We are listening to a witness that survived, but not cheaply. And there is one more reason we must not hurry here. The phrase "forbidden gifts" can tempt the modern mind toward the wrong kind of fascination. We hear it and imagine secret knowledge glittering in the dark. But the old witness is not admiring these teachings. It is exposing them. It is showing how a gift can become unclean when it arrives severed from rightful order, and how instruction itself can become a wound when the teacher stands outside obedience. So even this opening chamber must teach us the right posture. We are not voyeurs of ancient rebellion. We are listeners under warning. We are students of a text that names corruption, so that the human heart may learn to distrust brilliance when brilliance has broken covenant. That is why this first chamber stays narrow. It does not rush to spectacle. It does not yet hand you every name with every attached art. It teaches you how to hold the page. It teaches you to receive the old witness with both hunger and restraint. And that restraint, oddly enough, is already a kind of peace. Because the soul rests better when it stops trying to conquer a text and starts letting the text govern the pace. So the opening promise tonight is not comfort first, but clarity first. We will let comfort come later, after the manuscript has spoken. For now, the listener is simply asked to stay close, to count honestly, to hear the preserved strain, and to trust that the archive is worth the slower pace. And that means the next step cannot be casual. If there were chiefs, there was structure. If there was structure, there was agreement. If there was agreement, there was oath. And if there was oath, then before the names can be weighed, we must climb to the place where heaven's watchers bound themselves to a deed they already knew was ruin. So now, with the page still open before us, we turn toward the mountain, toward Hermon, toward the sworn descent, toward the moment rebellion stopped being desire alone and became a covenant of shared transgression. The exact question in this chamber is simple, though not light. Was the sin of the watchers merely a moment of desire? Or did the old witness preserve something more organized, more deliberate, more frightening than that? When we move into the 6th chapter of 1 Enoch, the story does not rush the answer. It begins with multiplication. The children of men increase upon the earth. Daughters are born to them, beautiful and comely. The scene opens not in chaos, but in fruitfulness. Human life is spreading. Creation is widening. And into that widening human world, the angels, the children of heaven, direct their gaze downward. That downward gaze matters. The old text is not merely telling us that desire erupted. It is telling us that heavenly beings saw, considered, spoke among themselves, and then moved toward an act that crossed boundaries meant to remain firm. Their rebellion is not described as a stumble. It is described as a proposal. Come, they say to one another, let us choose wives. There is something terrible in the calmness of that sentence, not because it shouts, but because it sounds decided. This is one of the hardest truths in all sacred history. Some of the gravest corruptions begin with collective speech that sounds almost reasonable to the participants. A boundary is crossed first in conversation. A forbidden act is softened by the fact that more than one voice is willing to speak it aloud. And then Semjaza enters the scene. The leader. Already the rebellion has shape. Already it has a head. Already it has hierarchy. And what Semjaza says is one of the most revealing lines in the whole passage. He fears that the others may not follow through, that they may shrink back from the deed, and that he alone will bear the penalty of a great sin. Now listen closely to that. Semjaza does not say the deed is righteous. He does not say there is no danger. He does not say God will approve. He knows there is penalty in it. He knows there is greatness in the sin. He knows enough already to be afraid. This is where the chamber grows morally sharp. The old witness shows us rebellion with prior knowledge. This is not innocent error. It is not ignorance. It is not naive curiosity. The leader himself anticipates judgment before the act is completed. And yet the fear of being left alone in guilt becomes the very thing that pushes the conspiracy into a more deliberate form. What does he want? He wants solidarity in evil. He wants company in transgression. He wants assurance that if there is punishment, it will not isolate him. And the others answer with a proposal that deepens the horror. Let us all swear an oath and bind ourselves by mutual imprecations that none of us will abandon the plan. This is no longer desire. This is covenantal rebellion. This is a fellowship arranged against obedience. This is a brotherhood formed not by worship, but by shared refusal. There are moments in Scripture and in sacred tradition when covenant language glows with holiness. People bind themselves to faithfulness, to truth, to remembrance, to the name of God. But here the shape of covenant is twisted. Oath, which can be a vessel of fidelity, becomes the harness of revolt. Mutual binding, which can steady the righteous, becomes the glue of shared corruption. And dear friend, there is a pastoral sadness in that which reaches far beyond the ancient mountain. Because human beings still do this. We still strengthen ourselves for wrong by making sure others are committed with us. We still fear solitary guilt more than collective rebellion. We still find courage for dark things by arranging witnesses who promise not to step away when conscience begins to tremble. That is why Hermon matters, not merely as a location, but as a theology of shared defiance. The text says they all swore together. They bound themselves by mutual imprecations. Then it tells us that the 200 descended in the days of Jared upon the summit of Mount Hermon, and that they called it Hermon because there they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations. The mountain becomes a memorial of their oath, a place name tied to rebellion, a height that receives not worship but conspiracy. Even the geography is scarred by the vow. I want you to notice how archive-like this is. The old witness does not simply say, they did evil. It preserves sequence, first sight, then speech, then fear, then oath, then dissent, then naming. The narrative moves like a record, kept by someone determined that future readers should understand how corruption matures. It does not arrive fully grown. It gathers itself. It seeks allies. It speaks in circles. It hardens by agreement. This is one reason the Watcher's story has endured with such disturbing force. It understands that evil often takes institutional form before it takes visible form. The rebellion is inwardly organized before it is outwardly enacted. And there is another detail here that deserves quiet attention. The descent occurs in the days of Jared. The tradition does not float in an undefined age. It anchors itself in genealogy, in remembered generations, in sacred time. Whatever questions scholars may raise about layers and transmission, the literary world of the text insists that this was not simply a cosmic rumor. It happened in the remembered age of a named human line. That, too, is part of the gravity. When a text places rebellion inside genealogy, it says something profound. It says corruption entered history, not merely heaven. It says this story belongs not only to celestial beings, but to the human family that received the wound. And this is where the atmosphere of the chamber changes. Because if the oath on Hermon is real within the witness, then everything that follows carries intentionality. The giants are not accidental. The teachings are not random. The corruption of human life is not an unstructured spill. It comes through a breach that was discussed, feared, ratified, and sealed. I think that is one of the reasons I am, as a pastor, cannot speak of this mountain casually. Hermon is not just the place where the angels came down. Hermon is the place where they made sure none of them could retreat without breaking faith with the others. There is something almost liturgical in the arrangement, and that is what makes it so dark. Forms that should belong to holy fidelity are bent toward unholy resolve. Speech, oath, naming, fellowship, dissent, memorializing a place all the architecture of order is still there, but the center has been turned. This is why forbidden gifts matter so much in the chapters ahead. Those gifts do not emerge from isolated accidents. They emerge from a rebellion that has already chosen structure over surrender and agreement over repentance. The teachings that later pour into the human world are downstream from Hermon, and perhaps that is why the story feels uncomfortably modern. We live in an age of systems, networks, shared signatures, coordinated transgression, techniques distributed widely before wisdom is formed. We know what it is for a destructive thing to become stronger because many hands agree to carry it together. The Watcher's narrative may be ancient, but its moral psychology is painfully contemporary. Yet I do not want to move too quickly into application. The page itself deserves patience. So let us remain with the mountain for a few more moments. Imagine the summit, not romantically, but judicially, a high place where the air is thin, where decisions seem to echo. Imagine the 200 gathered, not in confusion, but in a terrible kind of unanimity. Imagine the leader's fear of solitary punishment, and then the answer that solves his fear not by repentance, but by multiplication of guilt. Let us all swear. It is one of the saddest sentences in old sacred literature, because it reveals a longing that should have turned upward toward God and instead turned sideways toward accomplices. And from that sideways turning, the descent begins. No wonder the chapter does not begin with the list of names. First, it gives us the oath. First, it gives us the spiritual mechanics of the fall. First, it teaches us that before corruption is transmitted to the world, rebellion is normalized within a company. Only then are we ready for names. And even there, the text continues to think like an archive. It does not merely say, their leader was Semjaza. It begins to order the company. It will present them as chiefs of tens. It will imply rank, grouping, count, arrangement. That means the old witness wants us to understand the rebellion not simply as mass disobedience, but as organized leadership. This is crucial for tonight's title. We are not hunting names out of curiosity. We are not collecting mythological trivia. We are entering a preserved leadership structure of corruption. And if we hear it correctly, we will begin to understand why the later assignment of forbidden arts feels so weighty. Knowledge does not descend from nowhere. It descends through ordered channels. So keep Hermon in your mind, but do not keep it as scenery. Keep it as the place where rebellion took responsibility for itself, where heavenly beings bound themselves to a deed they already knew to be grievous, where a mountain became a witness, and where the architecture of oath was turned against the order of heaven. There is also a quiet irony here that should not be missed. In many ancient traditions, mountains are places of revelation. They are places where boundaries between heaven and earth feel charged with holiness, where commandments are received, where covenants are established, where the human creature learns reverence. Hermon, in this scene, becomes an inversion of that pattern. A high place still, a charged place still, a place of covenant still. But now, revelation has become conspiracy, and covenant has been turned into reinforcement for sin. The form remains elevated, while the allegiance has fallen. That inversion gives the whole mountain a bitter dignity. It is not merely a backdrop for lust. It is a counterfeit sanctuary. And once you hear Hermon that way, the chapter becomes even sadder. These watchers do not simply descend into appetite. They carry with them the memory of ordered fellowship and bend it. They remember enough of shared fidelity to imitate it in darkness. They know how to bind themselves. They know how to speak in one voice. They know how to make a place bear witness. They know how to turn decision into structure. What they lack is not capacity. What they lack is holy submission. That is always the deeper tragedy of rebellion. Ruined beings often retain astonishing powers of order, language, agreement, and endurance. What they lose is right orientation. So, before we move from mountain to list, let that sink in. The oath on Hermon is the moral key to everything that follows. Without Hermon, the forbidden arts can look like disconnected curiosities. With Hermon, we understand them as the fruit of a company that first chose collective loyalty to evil. The mountain stands behind every later, teaching like a dark foundation stone. And perhaps that is why the mountain must remain in the memory of the channel, not as scenery, but as diagnosis. Hermon shows how evil gathers courage by company. It shows how a deed becomes harder to resist once companions have vowed to protect one another from retreat. It shows how speech prepares sin, and how oath hardens speech into structure. When we later hear of weapons, enchantments, signs, and celestial arts, we should hear them with Hermon still behind them, because every forbidden lesson is the echo of a promise first made against obedience on that height above us. Now, the next chamber opens. The oath has been made. The descent has occurred. The mountain has received its name. And the old text, having shown us the shape of shared transgression, does something even more arresting. It begins to count. It gives us the chiefs of tens. It places names in a row. And there, at the point where a clean list should settle us, the manuscript tradition leaves us with a faint and unforgettable strain. So let us come closer to the line itself. Let us hear the names. And let us ask, with as much honesty as reverence, why a list that gestures toward 20 so often feels one voice short when we count it on the page. Now we reach the line that gives tonight's study its true pressure. The textual question in this chamber is exact. When the old witness describes the Watcher leaders as chiefs of tens, what are we meant to expect? And why do many familiar renderings of the preserved name list appear to leave us with fewer names than that expectation suggests? This is where a careful reader must slow down, because at first glance the passage looks simple. The rebellion has been introduced. The oath on Hermon has been made. The 200 have descended. Then the text says, in effect, these are the names of their leaders. In standard English renderings familiar to many readers, the list follows: Semjaza, their leader. Then Arakiba, Ramael, Kokabel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakijal, Asael, Armaros, Batarel, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsapil, Satarel, Turel, Jomiel, and Sariel. And then comes the concluding note. These are their chiefs of tens. If you read quickly, you may feel you have received what you came for. A list is a list. Names are there. The chapter moves on. But if you count slowly, and if you hold the closing phrase beside the actual row of names in the form many of us encounter, a subtle disturbance enters the room. Chiefs of tens suggests a company arranged in groups, a leadership structure among the 200. 20 leaders would fit that logic naturally. Yet the list as commonly printed appears to many readers to preserve only 19 names. That is the trouble. Not a loud trouble. A scribe's trouble. A transmission trouble. A trouble small enough to be missed and significant enough to govern the whole tone of our study. Now here we must be honest in the right way. Pastor Michael should neither overstate the problem nor smooth it away. We are not dealing with a childish contradiction meant to embarrass the text. We are dealing with the familiar reality of ancient transmission, where names pass through languages, copies, orthographies, and editorial judgments. Variants appear, spellings shift. Lines that once sat more clearly in one stage of the tradition may arrive less clearly in another. The point is not that the witness becomes useless. The point is that the witness asks for humility, and humility is one of the great missing virtues in modern reading. We like complete charts. We like numbered certainty. We like the feeling that if a title says 20, we can extract 20 with no residue, no questions, no silence, no strain. But the old archive resists that appetite. It tells us enough to guide us, enough to disturb us, enough to warn us, and enough to make us notice that memory itself has a history. Let us linger with the names themselves for a moment, because even before the numerical issue is resolved, their presence changes the spiritual atmosphere. Semjaza, Arakiba, Ramiel, Kokabel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakijel, Asael, Amoros, Batarel, Ananil, Zakiel, Samsapil, Satharel, Turel, Jomjael, Sariel. Do you feel it? The rebellion is no longer generic once the names are sounded aloud. A name does something to the mind. It individualizes, it gives contour, it resists blur. It says, the corruption of the world did not emerge from a faceless abstraction, but from a company with order, with rank, with remembered identity. Even if some names come to us through variant spellings, even if some forms differ between additions and transliterations, the effect remains. The tradition insists that leadership in evil was not anonymous. That matters more than many readers realize, because anonymity is one of the ways the conscience protects itself. If evil is vague, then responsibility remains vague. If corruption is atmospheric, then no one seems to have carried it. But the old witness will not allow that comfort. It puts names in a row. It asks us to hear that some forms of ruin come through identifiable agents. And then, just when we think the list should bring closure, the Count reopens the wound. Chiefs of Tans. That phrase is not decorative. It implies structure. It suggests subdivision within the 200. It points toward organization in the rebellion. That is why the numerical tension matters. The text seems to gesture toward a complete administrative order, but the preserved row in many common renderings sits uneasily against that expectation. Some readers respond by ignoring the strain altogether. Some respond by forcing a neat solution too quickly. But the better way, especially for a manuscript-first script, is to let the strain do its work. Let it remind us that ancient texts do not survive as pristine ideas floating above history. They survive through copying hands, through translators, through communities, through decisions, through losses, through recoveries. The Book of Enoch especially reaches us in a form whose full text survives in Ethiopic, while earlier Aramaic fragments and remnants of Greek witness only portions of the broader tradition. That means we receive a precious preservation, and, at the same time, a text that must be handled with scholarly restraint. So when the line feels slightly unsettled, we should not panic. We should listen harder. There is something else worth noticing here. Name lists in ancient literature often function as more than mere data. They establish legitimacy, continuity, order, memory. A list tells you that the writer, or the tradition behind the writer, does not want the event to dissolve into fable. A list says, remember these. A list says, the structure of this matter is important. A list says, there were heads to this thing. And that makes the instability of the Count even more poignant. It is as though the tradition extends its hand toward us with a full administrative frame, yet the line we receive still bears the wear of transmission. Not total loss, not total confusion. Just enough unevenness to keep us from pretending that we stand above the archive rather than under it. I think there is a spiritual lesson in that too. Some truths are preserved, not so that we may dominate them, but so that we may be chastened by them. The Watcher's story is one of those truths. We are allowed to know something. We are not allowed to know everything with the kind of mastery that abolishes dependence. That is fitting, perhaps, for a story about beings who sought knowledge and power outside holy order. Even the study of their names teaches us restraint. No, because this is a careful night study, I want to make one distinction very plain. The strain in the count is not the same thing as the absence of meaning. On the contrary, the list remains enormously meaningful. Semjaza still stands at the head. The chiefs are still presented as leaders among the 200. The tradition still moves from organized rebellion toward organized corruption. And later chapters still attach certain forbidden teachings to certain named figures with enough clarity to shape the title of our study. So we are not left empty-handed. We are left responsibly handed. And that is better. Better for the mind. Better for the soul. Better for the script. Because if we pretend the text is smoother than it is, then when we reach the forbidden gifts, we will be tempted to assign every remaining silence a certainty it does not possess. We will create a perfect modern chart where the witness itself gives a more uneven and therefore more credible pattern. Some teachings are clearly named with certain figures. Some are taught collectively. Some names remain weighty without receiving an exact attached craft in the same immediate way. That unevenness belongs to the moral shape of the archive. And I must tell you, dear friend, there is something almost hauntingly pastoral about a list like this. Not pastoral because it is soft. It is not soft. Pastoral because it teaches us how to live with a record that is clear enough to warn and incomplete enough to humble. A good shepherd does not lie about what the flock can see from the hilltop. He names what is visible. He admits what remains in mist. He does not invent a road where the path is broken. So let us keep the list before us exactly in that spirit. Not frustrated, not intoxicated, not careless, attentive. The names are there. The chiefs are there. The structure is there. The count presses on us, and the pressing itself becomes part of the title's hidden detail. Most listeners came expecting only mystery around fallen angels. Instead, the old page gives us administration, arrangement, rank, and a numerical unease that tells us the archive has been handed down, not manufactured yesterday for our convenience. There is also a literary tenderness in the way the list works upon the ear. Names slow a reader down, even when we are unsure of their original pronunciation. Even when the transliterations vary from edition to edition, we instinctively begin to speak more carefully. We do not glide across them the way we glide across summary. We step, we pause, we listen, and that very slowing is part of the text's power. The page refuses to let rebellion remain atmospheric. It compels articulation. It makes the mouth do the work of memory. It asks the listener to feel that these chiefs stood in sequence, in relation, in rank. I think that matters for sleep writing too. A list can soothe, yes, but it can also solemnize. It can narrow the mind to one line at a time. And here the narrowing serves the manuscript angle beautifully. Instead of offering broad mythology, the old witness places us under a register. Instead of giving us a cloud of menace, it gives us preserved identity with one strange fracture running through it. The line is orderly enough to be trusted and worn enough to be revered. That is the exact tone we need before the named gifts begin to emerge. And one more thing should be said before we leave this chamber. In old texts, a missing edge does not always weaken authority. Sometimes it reveals the honesty of transmission. A record polished too perfectly can feel suspiciously modern. A record that still bears the pressure of copying, translating, and preserving often feels more human and therefore more believable. The slight unease in this list keeps us from treating the Watchers as collectible lore. It reminds us that we are reading through witnesses, not bypassing them. That matters because the named gifts in the next chambers will carry more weight if we first admit how carefully the text must be handled. The row of names is not a prop. It is the threshold. And thresholds are holy partly because they slow the feet before judgment is ever spoken. This is why this information must not race ahead to the gifts too soon. First, the list must be felt as a list. First, the room must absorb the weight of named leadership. First, we must understand that the corruption which follows in Enoch is not presented as a loose spiritual accident, but as something directed through heads of a company. Semjaza at the front, others following. Names that sound like fragments of a broken register. Names that survived translation. Names carried across as witness. Names now opened again under a low lamp. And perhaps one place in the row that still feels oddly empty. Do not rush to fill that empty place. Let it remain for a little while, because that small silence trains us for the rest of the study. It teaches us that what survives will be enough, but it may not be neat. It teaches us to distinguish between preserved exactness and eager embellishment. It teaches us to honor both the confidence and the limits of the witness. And now, having heard the chiefs of tens and felt the strain in their count, we are finally ready to move closer to the individual names themselves. Not merely as a roster, not merely as a curiosity, but as the beginning of a darker inventory in which some names begin to carry exact forbidden arts. That is the next chamber. The list will open further. The names will begin to separate from one another, and soon one figure in particular will step forward with terrible clarity. Asael, the teacher of weapons, metals, ornament, and beautified surfaces. But before we go there, let the row remain before you one moment longer. A counted rebellion, a preserved list, a slightly troubled line, and a witness old enough to remind us that even damaged edges can still tell the truth. Until this point, the Watchers have moved before us as a sworn body, 200 descending, 200 binding themselves, 200 crossing a boundary together. But a list does not allow a body to remain blurred for very long. A list performs a kind of judgment before judgment. It places beings in sequence. It gives them order. It refuses the convenience of a crowd. And once the names begin, the rebellion no longer feels like weather. It feels like leadership. That is the exact question of this chamber. When the first names are spoken, what does the old witness accomplish by giving the rebellion a row of identifiable heads rather than leaving it in anonymity? The answer is not merely that the text wishes to satisfy curiosity. It is doing something more severe and more pastoral than that. It is teaching the listener that corruption does not arrive only as desire from below, or as confusion from nowhere. Sometimes it arrives under names that can be remembered, under leadership that can be traced, under a company that can be arranged. The list turns the story from abstraction into register. So let us come slowly to the opening cluster. Semjaza first. That alone matters. The old witness does not hide its leader in the middle. It places him at the front. The rebellion has a head, and the head has already spoken earlier in the chapter with revealing fear. He was the one afraid that the others would withdraw, and that he alone would bear the penalty of the great sin. So when his name appears now, at the top of the list, it is not an empty administrative move. It is a theological reminder. Leadership in evil is still leadership. Initiative in rebellion still carries shape. The one who first fears solitary punishment now stands at the head of a preserved row. There is a strange sadness in that, because names at the head of sacred lists are often names of blessing, names of lineage, names of covenant faithfulness, names that carry memory forward in hope. Here, the front name carries memory forward in warning. Semjaza becomes in this chamber the first sign that the old archive wants us to distinguish grades of participation. Not all corruption is equally distributed. There are heads of tens. There are organizing figures. There are those whose place in the row tells us that direction flowed through them. And after Semjaza come the others, one after another, like carved marks in a damaged register. Arakiba, Ramel, Kokabel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakijal. Do not hurry past them. A modern mind can become impatient with ancient name lists, because names often seem opaque when we do not share the world that first pronounced them. But opacity is not uselessness. In fact, part of the holiness of manuscript reading lies in accepting that some names reach us with more force than clarity, more contour than explanation. We may not recover every original resonance that an early hero would have felt, but we can still hear what the archive is doing. It is making us slow enough to understand that a hierarchy stood here. Let us take one name in this opening cluster. As tonight's archive note, Kokabel. The transliterated form varies across editions, but the name is commonly rendered in that recognizable shape, and later in Chapter 8 the figure is linked with the constellations. Already you can feel the script beginning to tighten. These are not names preserved for decoration. Some of them will soon bear attached arts. Some will carry specific corrupting instructions. So the list itself is the threshold of a darker inventory. And Pastor Michael must say something very plain here. Once a name in this row becomes linked to a teaching, the teaching becomes heavier, not lighter. It is one thing to say that dangerous knowledge entered the world. It is another to say that the world received it through remembered agents. That is why the list must be heard carefully before the gifts are opened. The names prepare the conscience for specificity. Arakiba, Ramiel, Kokabel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakijal. Even in speaking them aloud, something happens to the room. The pace drops. The breath changes. The listener begins to feel the row as a row, the sequence as a sequence. A list has its own liturgy. It can be dry if handled carelessly, but if read with low lamplight and patient seriousness, it becomes almost architectural. Each name is like a pillar. Each pillar tells you the structure was real enough to require arrangement. And this is one reason the opening cluster deserves its own chamber. If we were to leap immediately toward Asael and the weapon arts, we would miss the older effect of the list itself. We would miss the fact that Enoch, or the tradition behind Enoch, did not simply preserve the most sensational figure and discard the rest. The page keeps a company. It records a leadership body. It suggests that the corruption of humankind was not only enabled by one notorious teacher, but by a network of ranked participation that has moral implications. It tells us that evil often functions as a consortium before it becomes a spectacle. It tells us that the world can be damaged by clusters of authority. It tells us that a central figure may stand out, but the larger company still matters. And there is another quiet reason these first names matter. They guard us from the modern temptation to reduce the Watcher's story to a single villain. Ancient texts often preserve complexity where later retellings prefer concentration. We like stories easier when one dark figure carries the entire burden of blame. But the old witness resists that simplification. It gives a row. It gives companions. It gives chiefs. It tells us that rebellion was plural before its consequences became public. That is a hard truth, but a helpful one. Communities rarely decay because one teacher stands alone in the square. More often, a mood is built, an order is formed, a permission structure develops, a cluster of voices normalizes what should have been refused. This is why the opening names carry such weight even before every one of them receives a specific attached art. Their presence tells us that the crisis is collective at the level of leadership. Now, let us remain briefly with Barakijal, because this name also opens a doorway into the next level of the study. Later in the text, Barakijal is linked with astrology. That means, already, within this opening cluster, one can feel a shift beginning from mere identity toward function. The list is not only saying who stood there, it is preparing to show what some of them brought down with them. And here Pastor Michael's personal observation belongs close to the page. One of the most unsettling features of the Watcher's story is that the forbidden gifts are not grotesque in an obvious way. Many of them belong to the kinds of things human beings easily admire: skill, elegance, prediction, adornment, technique, mastery, interpretation of signs. That is why the names must come first. Without the names, the gifts might seduce the imagination. With the names, they become evidence. The opening cluster also teaches us how to live with textual unevenness without losing reverence. Some of these names will remain more shadowed than others. Some will later receive clear attached roles. Others will not. Some may stand before us more as preserved presences than as fully mapped personalities. Yet that too is part of the manuscript truth. Ancient witness is often asymmetrical. Not every column is equally bright. Not every margin carries the same weight. But the page still speaks. So here the first cluster, not as failed detail, but as deliberate contour. Semjaza at the head, then the row widening, then the sense that the company has an inner arrangement, then the first hints that certain names will soon carry more exact charges. And under all of it, the old archive teaching us patience. I confess that there is something very human in the way a list like this works on the heart. When we are tired, we often want large summaries. We want someone to tell us in a single sentence what the problem is. But scripture and sacred traditions sometimes heal the mind by making it attend to particulars. A name list can humble the overconfident intellect. It can say, in effect, "You do not understand this story yet, until you have slowed down enough to hear the row." So tonight, the row itself is part of the mercy. It teaches us that memory is not preserved only in ideas. It is preserved in sequence, in order, in names that survive even when their attached meanings have dimmed, in the stubborn refusal of the witness to let the company dissolve into mythic blur. And before we leave this chamber, let us take one more archive note from the opening cluster. Barakijal, often rendered with that striking shape, later linked to astrology. Why does that matter tonight? Because it tells us that the list is not inert. It is charged. Some names in the row are live wires leading directly into the forbidden curriculum. They are not simply there to lengthen the register. They are anchors to arts, signs, and techniques that the text regards as part of humanity's corruption. There is also something almost monastic in the act of preserving a difficult row of names. Names are among the first things a hurried tradition will shorten, modernize, or smooth away. Yet here they remain, even in transliterated forms that resist easy pronunciation. That resistance is meaningful. It reminds us that we are guests in an older textual house. We are not free to rename the inhabitants simply because their syllables arrive awkwardly in our mouths. Reverent reading means letting the foreignness stay foreign long enough to teach us patience. A list like this trains the listener not only to ask what happened, but to honor how the witness has chosen to remember it. And perhaps that is why the opening cluster sounds so solemn under a low voice. Semjaza and the others are not introduced with biographies or explanations. They are given to us as preserved presence. The archive does not flatter our need for immediacy. It asks us to accept that some names do their work simply by surviving. They tell us that the rebellion had more structure than summary can hold. They tell us that memory was curated, not improvised. They tell us that sacred tradition sometimes preserves enough detail to burden the conscience without satisfying every modern curiosity. That is a severe kind of gift, but a gift nonetheless. There is one more quiet effect, produced by the opening cluster. It keeps us from romanticizing obscurity. We often imagine that if a name is ancient and difficult, it must therefore be mystical in a flattering way. But the archive does not flatter. It simply preserves. A difficult name may be mysterious, yes, but it may also be a burden, a warning, a surviving mark of judgment. These names are not candles on a shrine. They are entries in a damaged register of revolt. To hear them slowly is to let the text cleanse us of the childish desire to treat forbidden beings as glamorous. And because this is a manuscript chamber, not a fantasy chamber, we should let the names do their sober work. They are preserved not so that we may imagine hidden greatness in them, but so that we may feel how thoroughly the witness resists anonymity. Lists also keep pride from pretending it has mastered a subject too quickly. A summary can be consumed in seconds. A row of names must be endured, sounded, counted, respected. That endurance changes the reader. It replaces curiosity with attention. It replaces appetite with reverence. And for a manuscript first night like this one, that is exactly the right beginning. It asks us to count carefully, speak slowly, and remember that every surviving line deserves more honesty than excitement tonight. That is why this chamber must end not in closure, but in tightening focus. We have heard the company begin to separate. We have heard the front of the row. We have felt the rebellion become structured. We have noticed that some names already stand near later teachings. But the next chamber will bring us to the name that burns most clearly in the old text. The name most directly associated with worked metal, sharpened violence, ornamented surfaces, darkened eyes, and beautified appearance. Asael. When that name steps forward, the Watcher's story becomes even more disturbing, because the corruption of the world will no longer sound merely cosmic. It will sound practical, material, fashioned, worn, held in the hand, fixed to the body, reflected in the mirror. So keep the opening cluster before you as the doorway it is. The list has begun. The chiefs are no longer faceless. And now, the archive narrows its beam toward one teacher whose gifts look, at first glance, almost useful enough to admire. The exact question of this chamber is this: why does Asael stand out so powerfully in the Watcher's tradition when the old witness begins to connect names with forbidden gifts? The answer lies in the nature of the teachings themselves. Some corruptions are inward enough that they can still pretend to be abstract. Some can disguise themselves as hidden arts, subtle influences, things half believed and half feared. But the gifts attached to Asael arrive in the world with hard edges and visible glitter. They can be held, hammered, worn, displayed, marketed, admired, and precisely because they look useful, they are among the most dangerous. The familiar English rendering of 1 Enoch says that Azazel, and here we should note softly that editions and transliterations may give the form as Azazel or Asael in related discussion, taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and the line does not stop at war. It continues into bracelets, ornaments, the use of antimony, the beautifying of the eyelids, costly stones, and coloring tinctures. The effect of that sequence is overwhelming if one hears it slowly. Weapons, metallurgy, adornment, cosmetic enhancement, precious surfaces, tinted appearance. A whole civilization of sharpened force and curated beauty begins to gather around one name. This is why Asael can never be treated in the script as merely one figure among many. The page itself brings him forward with unnerving clarity. His gifts do not belong to one narrow domain. They spread across violence and display, conflict and seduction, craftsmanship and vanity. The text wants us to feel that a certain kind of corruption entered the human world, not only by making it more deadly, but by making it more dazzled. Let us begin with the first cluster. Swords, knives, shields, breastplates. These are not random objects. They belong to the organized management of violence. The teaching is not simply aggression in the abstract. It is technique. It is fabrication. It is the shaping of raw material into instruments of attack and protection. And there is an irony already hidden there. Even the shield and the breastplate, which seem defensive, are part of a world in which conflict has become an art. The teaching does not merely arm a moment, it builds a system. Then the text moves into the metals of the earth and the art of working them. This matters because the sin here is not described as material existence itself. The earth's metals are not evil by nature. The earth was made by God. The problem is not creation. The problem is the illicit transmission and deformation of craft under rebellious instruction. That distinction is important for Pastor Michael's tone. The old witness is not preaching hatred of matter. It is warning against knowledge received outside holy order and bent toward domination, display, and bloodshed. And then, with startling rapidity, the passage turns from forged violence toward beautified surfaces, bracelets, ornaments, antimony, beautifying of the eyelids, costly stones, coloring tinctures. One can almost feel a modern reader hesitate here. Why does the text place cosmetics so near weapons? Why do painted eyes stand beside sharpened blades? Why are adornment and metallurgy pressed into one teacher's dossier? The answer, I think, is that the old witness is tracing a common moral thread: the manipulation of surfaces for the sake of power. A sword changes what the hand can do. A shield changes how conflict is entered. A breastplate changes how the body is presented in war. Antimony changes how the eye appears. Costly stones and ornament change how the body is displayed in desire, status, and seduction. In every case, nature is not merely received, it is worked upon, styled, intensified, weaponized, or glamorized. The body and the earth both become sites of intensified effect. Now, Pastor Michael must tread carefully here, with warmth and seriousness. The point of the passage is not to flatten all beauty into sin. Scripture itself knows holy beauty, priestly beauty, adorned worship, crafted skill offered to God. The problem in Enoch is not beauty as thanksgiving. The problem is beautification as corruption joined to rebellion, joined to seduction, joined to the disordered handing over of power. The same applies to craft. There are holy crafts in the biblical imagination. There are also crafts taught within a fallen order for the enlargement of violence, vanity, and control. That is why Asael is so spiritually revealing. He teaches us that one of the enemy's oldest strategies is to offer useful things first. Useful metals, useful defenses, useful tools, useful enhancements, beautiful surfaces, improved appearances, practical arts. And because they are useful, because they can be admired, because they can be integrated into ordinary life, the corruption spreads quietly. It does not always announce itself as wickedness. Sometimes it arrives looking like advancement. This is where tonight's manuscript study becomes piercingly human. How often has the world been harmed by knowledge that dazzled before it disciplined? How often have people embraced a technique because it extended power, refined image, or promised control, without asking what kind of soul that technique was shaping. The old witness is not anti-skill. It is anti-rebellion. It is anti-power severed from obedience. It is anti-brilliance received from the wrong hands. And this is why Asael becomes, in so many retellings, the most unforgettable name in the list. Not because he alone matters, but because his portfolio of corruption touches some of the most visible zones of human life. War, wealth, display, craftsmanship, sensual attraction, status signaling, body image, and the conversion of created things into intensified surfaces. There is another layer here that deserves slow attention. The text does not merely say that Asael taught weapons. It says he taught men to make them. That phrase matters. Teaching someone to make is different from simply handing them a finished object. It creates continuity. It creates culture. It creates the possibility of repetition, improvement, trade, inheritance, expansion. A technique taught can outlive the teacher. A fabrication skill can travel through generations. And suddenly the watcher's story feels even heavier. The corruption is not only in the first act, it is in the transmissibility of the art. That is why Pastor Michael should linger over the phrase, the art of working them. Art, working, skill, method. The old witness understands that evil deepens when it becomes teachable. And here I want to offer a brief personal observation in the spirit of tonight's study. Some truths are buried for centuries because they are too exact to flatter us. We prefer stories in which darkness is grotesque and easy to spot. But Enoch gives us a darker realism. Darkness may arrive with polished technique. It may train the hand beautifully. It may sharpen the eye. It may teach refinement. It may even make the body appear more desirable and the warrior appear more prepared. In other words, corruption may present itself as excellence. That is a hard line to hear at night, but it is an honest one, and perhaps honesty itself is one of the gentlest gifts a sacred text can offer a weary soul. Because if the heart learns that usefulness is not the same thing as goodness, and brilliance is not the same thing as holiness, then the heart becomes a little less easy to deceive. Now let us return to the cosmetic cluster for one more moment, because it is easy to reduce it to a footnote. It is not a footnote. The beautifying of the eyelids and the use of antimony matter because the eye is one of the oldest sites of encounter in Scripture. To alter the eye is not simply to decorate the body. It is to intensify appearance, to magnify effect, to present the self as an edited surface. Again, the issue is not ordinary human care. The issue is the Enochic pattern of rebellious knowledge, altering human presentation within a larger movement of seduction, luxury, and distortion. So the Asael chamber places before us a deeply revealing pairing. Blades and beauty, weapons and ornament, blood and glamour. That pairing is not accidental. It suggests that the old witness sees a common corruption in the manipulation of material reality for heightened human appetite and power. The earth is mined, the metal is worked, the body is adorned, the eye is darkened. The social field changes. Violence is more efficient. Desire is more directed. Appearance becomes more curated. And all of it is traced back, not to neutral progress, but to forbidden instruction. No wonder the earth later cries out in the Enochic world. The wound has entered both body and culture. And no wonder Asael's name continues to carry such force in modern discussions of the Watchers. He represents the moment when rebellion becomes tangible, manufacturable, wearable, and transmissible. He gives the old text one of its clearest links between celestial transgression and human civilization. But here again, the manuscript first discipline matters. We must say exactly what the text says and no more. It gives Asael a powerful cluster of arts. It makes him central to this domain of corruption. That is enough. We do not need to inflate the line with later fantasy. The ancient witness is already severe. I want to linger a little longer over that severity, because it teaches us how the passage thinks. Asael is not portrayed merely as a war maker, nor merely as a corrupter of beauty. He is a teacher of transformation. He teaches human beings how to alter what is given. Metal in the ground becomes weapon in the hand. Stone becomes ornament on the body. Powder becomes a darkened eye. Raw matter becomes intensified appearance. The common thread is not just violence or vanity, but the disciplined reshaping of creation for magnified human effect. That is why this chamber reaches so deeply into the modern soul. We live among techniques of enhancement. We know what it is to admire what has been refined, sharpened, curated, optimized, displayed. The old witness asks a harder question than usefulness. It asks, who taught the hand to hunger for this form of power, and toward what end? There is another line hidden inside the passage. The moral closeness of the forge and the mirror. In Asael's teaching, the instrument of injury and the instrument of allure grow strangely near one another. One prepares the body for battle. The other prepares the face for effect. One amplifies force. The other amplifies appearance. Together, they suggest that fallen knowledge does not care whether it conquers through fear or fascination. It only seeks entrance. It only seeks embodiment. It only seeks to make itself habitual in human life. Once that happens, corruption no longer feels exotic. It feels cultured. And that may be one of the darkest notes in the whole Watcher's tradition. The text is not depicting chaos alone. It is depicting sophistication. The danger lies partly in refinement. Evil can become elegant. Evil can become skilled. Evil can learn proportion, finish, polish, balance, timing, and marketable desirability. It can teach people to admire what wounds them. It can persuade a generation that invention itself is innocent, because invention is impressive. That is why Asael's name should be spoken tonight with sober weight. He represents the seduction of crafted power. And perhaps the sharpest edge in the Asael passage is this. Nothing here looks crude. The arts are advanced. They require practice. They reward attention. They improve human capability. That is exactly why the text is so unnerving. It suggests that a civilization can become more technically impressive and more spiritually diseased at the same time. It can discover better materials, better finishes, better tools, better presentations of the body, and still move farther from holy order. The ancient witness does not despise excellence. It simply refuses to confuse excellence with innocence. If that line lands with some sadness tonight, it should. Many people have learned the hard way that what glitters can still wound, and what works can still deform. A soul can become surrounded by effective things and yet lose its ability to recognize what is good. Asael stands in the text as a teacher of exactly that confusion. He gives humanity the thrill of increased capacity without the shelter of sanctified wisdom. That is why the old page joins warfare and ornament without apology. It knows that fallen power may advance through intimidation on one day and fascination on the next. The forge and the mirror can serve the same rebellion when both teach the creature to seek intensified effect apart from sanctified love. There is a further sorrow in the phrase, made known. The text does not describe Asael as merely experimenting for himself. He discloses. He reveals. He opens a chamber that had not belonged to human stewardship. That is why the damage feels civilizational. Once a forbidden thing is made known, innocence cannot be restored by ignorance. The knowledge enters memory. It enters craft. It enters aspiration. It enters trade. It enters imitation. A child can inherit what a rebel first unveiled, and this helps explain why the earth itself later seems burdened in Enoch's vision. The wound is not only moral in the private sense, it is cultural. Entire patterns of life become easier to imagine once a people have been taught that every buried metal can be summoned upward. Every surface can be intensified. Every body can be upgraded into an instrument of fear or fascination. That is why Asael's dossier feels so immense. It is not one sin. It is a grammar for many. So when we hear Asael tonight, we should hear more than accusation. We should hear diagnosis. The passage is uncovering the human tendency to call something good because it is effective, desirable, or beautifully made. That tendency has not vanished. It still presses on every age. And perhaps that is why this old name still sounds so sharp. It exposes the seduction of skill without sanctity, and brilliance without reverence. The text teaches admiration, to kneel before holiness, or else become one more willing servant of ruin. So let the list rest in its proper order. Asael does not erase the others. He intensifies the row. He shows what it means when a name in the register becomes a portfolio. He shows how the title's phrase, forbidden gifts, should really be heard not as magical curiosities, but as destructive forms of knowledge whose danger lies partly in how attractive they first appear. And as we leave this chamber, we must remember that not all the teachings arrive with metal and visible splendor. Some move more quietly. Some work in words, roots, enchantments, hidden resolutions, and whispered techniques. If Asael gives us corruption in the forge and on the face, the next chamber will bring us corruption in subtler forms, where speech, roots, and unseen manipulations begin to shape the world from another angle. That means we must return now to Semjaza, and then to Armoros, and to the old witnesses' distinction between what the Watchers taught collectively and what some of them are said to have taught by name. The forge is not the whole wound. The painted eye is not the whole wound. The hand is not the only place corruption enters. Sometimes it begins in the whispered promise that hidden techniques can help a human being master what ought to be received with trust. We have now reached one of the most delicate chambers in the script, because the exactness of the title depends on a careful distinction. The question here is this: how does the old witness move from collective corruption in Chapter 7 to named assignments in Chapter 8? And what does that teach us about Semjaza, Armoros, and the forbidden knowledge of enchantments, root cuttings, and plants? This chamber must be handled gently, because modern readers often flatten it. They hear, "The Watchers taught forbidden arts," and they assume the text gives a neat list in which every name carries one precise craft in equal clarity. But that is not how the passage actually breathes. Chapter 7 tells us that all the others together with them took wives, defiled themselves, and taught charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made mankind acquainted with plants. That is collective language. It presents a shared corruption, a general diffusion of arts within the company. Then Chapter 8 narrows and names. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. And suddenly, we begin to see the archive, distinguishing between what the company spread broadly and what certain figures exemplified by name. That distinction matters for truthfulness. It also matters for the beauty of the script, because the old witness here is not clumsy. It is layered. It first shows a company poisoning the human world with a common curriculum. Then, almost like a scribe leaning closer to the parchment, it says, "Now let me show you some of the teachers more exactly. So let us begin again. with Semjaza. He stood at the front of the leadership list. He voiced the fear of punishment. He sought solidarity in sin. And now, in the named teaching sequence, he is linked with enchantments and root cuttings. How fitting that the leader of the oath should also stand near the arts of hidden influence. The word enchantments, in modern ears, can sound theatrical. But in the moral logic of the passage, it points toward efforts to manipulate unseen outcomes, to bend reality through illicit knowledge, to grasp effect without obedience. Enchantment, in this setting, is not merely spectacle. It is the desire to exert leverage over the world without submitting to the order of the Creator. And then come the roots. Root cuttings. This detail is easy to miss, but it is one of the most haunting in the whole Watcher's narrative. Roots belong to what is hidden beneath the surface. They are buried life, secret structure, the unseen anchoring of visible growth. To teach root cuttings is to teach human beings how to intervene beneath the visible layer of things. It evokes technique, extraction, hidden properties, subterranean effects. Now again, Pastor Michael must speak carefully. Plants are part of God's creation. Roots are not evil. Healing herbs, cultivated gardens, and wise use of created things belong elsewhere in Scripture to gratitude and stewardship. The problem here is not creation, but illicit mastery. The issue is the handing over of hidden techniques as power severed from right relation to God. That is why the text places root cuttings so close to enchantments. The pairing suggests a world in which hidden properties and hidden words become instruments of control. Human beings are no longer simply receiving creation as gift. They are being trained to manipulate its concealed depths for ends that emerge from rebellion. And then, Armaros appears with a chilling refinement, the resolving of enchantments. What does that mean? At the very least, it implies a system advanced enough not only to cast or use enchantments, but to interpret, untangle, answer, counteract, or perhaps release them. In other words, once forbidden knowledge enters the world, it quickly becomes self-complicating. One illicit technique requires another to manage its consequences. A dark art generates a secondary art. Corruption breeds expertise in resolving the very webs corruption has woven. That is painfully human. How many of our deepest troubles grow exactly that way? A first disordered skill enters life, promising leverage. Then, another skill becomes necessary to manage the damage. Then, a class of specialists emerges around the fallout. The old text may be ancient, but it understands the recursive nature of fallen knowledge. Semjaza teaches enchantments and roots. Armaros teaches the resolving of enchantments. One initiates hidden leverage. Another manages the complexities that leverage produces. The result is not wisdom. It is a culture of manipulation, and this, dear friend, is why this chamber has such quiet power for a sleepless listener. Many tired hearts are not destroyed first by open violence. They are worn down by the fantasy of control, the desire to master outcomes, decode hidden patterns, access buried powers, pull certainty out of the unseen. These things can look almost spiritual. They can even appear patient and intelligent. But the Enochic witness warns that not every hidden knowledge deserves trust simply because it feels deep. And if we stay very close to the language of roots, another human truth appears. Roots work in darkness. They are patient. They spread beneath what the eye can monitor. They feed what later appears above ground as visible life. That makes them a fitting image for hidden systems of influence. To cut at roots is to intervene where ordinary observers do not look. To become fascinated with roots can become a hunger to operate below the surface of the world, below the surface of people, below the surface of providence itself. The passage does not mock the hiddenness of creation. It warns against taking hiddenness as permission for mastery. In that sense, the root's image is almost a parable of temptation. We want to get beneath mystery, not always to revere it, but often to use it. There is also a manuscript beauty in the movement from chapter 7 to chapter 8. The collective material keeps us from isolating blame too neatly. The named material keeps us from dissolving responsibility into a mist. Together they form a truthful pattern. The company corrupted together. Certain figures stand out more sharply as representatives of that corruption. The text is both broad and precise. There is one more reason this chamber matters before we ascend to the heavens of signs and courses. Hidden arts feel intimate. They promise private leverage. They whisper that the initiated person will not have to remain vulnerable before mystery like everyone else. That is why they seduce so deeply. They do not simply offer knowledge. They offer exemption from dependence. And once a heart begins to crave that exemption, it becomes easier to accept any teacher who seems to provide it, no matter how misordered the source may be. So this chamber leaves us with a warning that is almost tender in its honesty. Not every deeper layer is meant to be cut open by restless hands, and not every secret that promises power is worthy of trust. And perhaps that is where this chamber speaks most directly to the modern heart. Many of us are tired because we are always trying to get underneath everything. Underneath motives, underneath outcomes, underneath timing, underneath uncertainty, underneath the silence of God. We keep searching for a route we can cut, a code we can decode, a hidden process we can master, as though peace will finally come once nothing remains mysterious. But peace rarely comes that way. Peace usually comes when the soul learns where mastery must stop and trust must begin. That is what makes the Watcher's story so searching. It exposes not only ancient beings, but ancient temptations still alive in us. That is why Semjaza and Armoros belong together so naturally in this section. One opens the door to hidden leverage. The other stands near the secondary techniques needed once hidden leverage has complicated the world. The pattern is ancient, but familiar. First, we are promised access. Then we are promised management. Then we are told that with enough method, nothing need remain beyond our grasp. The old witness answers that lie, not with panic, but with exposure. That is the mercy hidden in the warning. The passage does not forbid wonder, it forbids grasping. It does not despise depth, it exposes theft. It does not shame mystery, it protects mystery from hands that cannot yet hold it with reverence, patience, restraint. That means the title phrase, exact forbidden gifts, must be heard with disciplined nuance. Exact where the passage is exact, collective where the passage is collective, reverent where the manuscript is reverent, restrained where the witness grows thin. This is where the Pastor Michael voice can help the listener rest, not by becoming vague, but by becoming honest. There is a special peace in being told the truth carefully. We do not have to pretend the text gives more than it gives. We do not have to force a symmetry the old page does not insist upon. We can let chapter 7 speak broadly and chapter 8 speak more narrowly. We can let Semjaza and Armoros step forward without demanding that every remaining name be forced into the same degree of clarity. And perhaps that is one reason the root's image lingers so strongly with me tonight. Buried things are always morally powerful in Scripture. Buried treasure, buried bones, buried seed, buried words in the heart. Here, buried life becomes part of a forbidden curriculum. Something underneath is being accessed, cut, handled, and converted into leverage. It is a vivid picture of what corruption often wants. Not merely the visible fruit, but the concealed mechanism. There is a brief human tenderness that belongs here too. Many people know what it is to carry a question for a long time, to want the hidden answer, the deeper lever, the secret way to make life yield. There is nothing sinful in longing to understand. But the Watcher's story warns that longing can become vulnerable when it turns from reverent asking toward illicit control. The difference between wisdom and corruption is often not intensity of desire, but source and posture. That is why Semjaza remains such a fitting teacher for this domain. He is the leader who feared penalty, yet chose covenantal rebellion. Of course, he becomes associated with arts that promise influence without surrender. The inner logic holds, and Armaros follows almost naturally. Because once one enters a world of manipulative technique, another must arise to answer its knots. Resolving enchantments is not innocence restored. It is corruption becoming more articulate. Now, we should not leave Chapter 7 behind too quickly. Its collective mention of making people acquainted with plants also deserves reverent caution. Again, the issue is not simple botanical awareness. The issue is a pattern in which hidden properties of the created world are drawn into a rebellious system of manipulation. The human relation to the garden is being altered. Creation is no longer approached primarily as gift, stewardship, and praise. It becomes an inventory of exploitable powers. And once that happens, the moral landscape changes. The root is no longer only nourishment. The plant is no longer only received. The hidden property is no longer only wondered at. Everything becomes potentially instrumental. Everything becomes available for effect. That is why this chamber belongs after Asael and not before him. Asael gave us visible corruption in metal and appearance. Semjaza and Armaros give us hidden corruption in words, roots, and unseen techniques. Together, they show how complete the wound becomes. The outer world is forged and adorned. The inner world is manipulated and managed. Human civilization is being taught how to alter both surface and depth. And in that sense, the Watcher's story is not primitive at all. It is profoundly perceptive. It understands that fallen knowledge does not stay in one lane. It moves through war, beauty, speech, medicine-like secrets, hidden properties, and systems of control. It enters culture broadly, so let the names stand now with their proper weight. Semjaza, enchantments and root cuttings. Armaros, the resolving of enchantments. Chapter 7. The company together teaching charms, enchantments, root cuttings, and acquaintance with plants. That is enough for this chamber. Enough to keep the title honest. Enough to keep the manuscript angle alive. Enough to prepare us for the next sequence, when the heavens themselves will seem to become a corrupted curriculum through astrology, constellations, cloud knowledge, the signs of the earth, the signs of the sun, and the course of the moon. But for now, stay here a little longer with the buried things. The roots below the soil, the words below ordinary speech, the arts below visible surfaces. The old witness is telling us that corruption did not only sharpen blades and beautify faces, it also taught human beings to reach under the visible world in search of leverage. And that, perhaps, is why the soul grows tired under forbidden knowledge. It is always trying to get beneath trust, so we will let this chamber close gently. The forge has cooled for a moment. The painted eye has dimmed, and now the page waits to show us another kind of damage altogether. The corruption of signs above us, where some of the watchers turn the sky itself into a school of restless power. Until this point, much of the corruption has felt close to the body and close to the hand. Asael gave us metal, weaponry, ornament, painted surfaces, and all the moral ambiguity that comes when technique enters human life without sanctified order. Semjaza and Armaros gave us hidden leverage in enchantments, root cuttings, and the resolving of subtle manipulations. But in this chamber, the forbidden curriculum rises higher. It reaches upward into signs, seasons, courses, patterns, movements, and the visible architecture of the sky. That is the exact question here. When the old witness names Barakijal, Kokabel, Ezekiel, Arakiel, Shamsiel, and Sariel, with teachings related to the heavens and the earth, what kind of corruption is being described? Is the text condemning the created order itself? Or is it warning against a distorted way of handling signs that were meant to be received under reverence? We must answer that carefully, because this part of Enoch is often misunderstood. The passage does not sound like a rejection of creation. The heavens are not evil. The sun is not evil. The moon is not evil. Clouds are not evil. The earth and its signs are not evil. Scripture elsewhere can speak of the heavens declaring the glory of God, of lights appointed for signs and seasons, of created order revealing divine wisdom. The issue here is not that the world is intelligible. The issue is that rebellious teachers have turned intelligibility into illicit possession. That is a very different thing. So let us move slowly through the names. Barakijal, the text says, taught astrology. Already the chamber grows serious. Astrology here is not presented as innocent awe before the stars, nor as a child looking upward in wonder. It belongs to a pattern in which the sky becomes a field of influence, prediction, leverage, and interpretive power, detached from obedient worship. The difference matters. To gaze upward and praise the Maker is one thing. To gaze upward and imagine that one can command, decode, or secure the future through celestial patterning is another. This is why Barakijal matters tonight. The name shows that the corruption of the world in Enoch is not merely sensual or violent, it is interpretive. It affects the way human beings read reality. Once the stars become not signs under God but instruments for grasping power, human consciousness itself becomes disordered. The heavens cease to humble and begin to flatter the appetite for control. Then comes Kokabel, linked with the constellations. And here, the danger grows subtler still. Constellations are arrangements. They are patterns. They invite the mind to trace connections. One can feel immediately why such knowledge would fascinate the human heart. Patterns promise orientation. Patterns promise hidden coherence. Patterns whisper that life may become manageable if only one learns the celestial map correctly. But again, the Enochic witness places this teaching in the wrong hands. That is the key. The problem is not that creation has order. The problem is the illicit transfer of pattern knowledge by beings already bound together in rebellion. It is as though the text is saying, some knowledge becomes morally unstable, not because the object is evil, but because the source and posture are corrupt. That is a searching thought, because modern minds are often less concerned with the moral character of a source than with the usefulness of what is learned. If the pattern works, if the chart predicts, if the system yields insight, we are tempted to call it wisdom. But Enoch slows us down. It asks, who taught it? Under what allegiance? And toward what human desire? Then Ezekiel is named with the knowledge of the clouds. What a curious phrase. The knowledge of the clouds. Why should that matter so much? Clouds belong to transition, weather, concealment, movement, and uncertainty. They gather, they dissolve, they obscure the heavens, and then reveal them again. To know the clouds is to seek access to changing signs, to read what shifts overhead, to track patterns that seem half open and half hidden. There is something deeply human in the desire for such knowledge. People long to know what is coming. They long to read weather in the soul, weather in history, weather in providence. The cloud is one of the oldest symbols of mystery, and mystery is precisely what the fallen appetite hates to leave alone. That is why the phrase feels morally charged. In the old witness, the knowledge of the clouds can be heard not as humble observation, but as participation in a larger project of grasping the upper order of the world for human leverage. Then comes Asael, or in some renderings Asael's near equivalent, associated with the signs of the earth. Now the movement is extraordinary. The curriculum spans both above and below. We have stars, constellations, clouds, and now the signs of the earth. The text is drawing a totalizing map of corruption. These teachers do not simply intrude into one narrow domain. They train humanity to read the whole field of reality in a disordered way. The heavens above, the earth below, the visible motions, the hidden signs, the changing atmosphere, the stable ground, all become part of a curriculum severed from holy order. And what are the signs of the earth? At minimum, the phrase suggests patterns, indicators, portents, readable markers embedded in the terrestrial world. It is another way of saying that the human creature is being taught to treat the created order as a coded system available for extraction, control, or illicit interpretation. Instead of receiving the earth as gift, boundary, and creaturely home, people are trained to read it as a manipulable network of signs. Then Asael enters with the signs of the sun. Again, hear the subtlety. The sun in biblical imagination is glorious, regular, life-giving, a faithful servant of God within ordered creation. But once signs of the sun are detached from worship and given over as a form of power, the daily order itself becomes vulnerable to misuse. Humans do not merely rejoice in the sunrise. They seek to turn solar regularity into a technology of mastery. And finally, Asael is linked with the course of the moon. The course, movement, cyclicality, measured return. The moon marks times, shifts, rhythms, nights. It is the companion of calendars, festivals, and sacred reckonings elsewhere in Scripture. So again, the corruption does not lie in the moon. It lies in the illicit appropriation of its ordered course for an agenda not governed by reverence. By now, the pattern should be unmistakable. The old witness is describing a revolt against creaturely limits through the appropriation of created order. The sky is not rejected. It is misused. The earth is not denied. It is overread. The regular motions of the heavens are not praised in their place. They are drawn into systems of power. This is why I have called these figures the corrupted teachers of the heavens. They do not invent the stars. They do not create the moon. They do not hang the clouds. They do not found the earth. What they do is transform the human relation to all these things. They train people to approach signs as possession rather than praise. And perhaps that is one of the deepest insights in this portion of Enoch. Corruption often does not begin by denying the beauty of the world. It begins by offering a way to use beauty for control. It begins by turning wonder into leverage. It begins by taking what should have led the heart upward in worship and making it serve anxiety, ambition, prediction, and influence. Now, Pastor Michael should pause here with one quiet human observation. Many troubled people do not seek forbidden knowledge because they are theatrical or sinister. They seek it because they are afraid. They want to know what will happen. They want reassurance. They want certainty. They want to feel that the universe can be read closely enough to stop surprise from hurting them. That desire is deeply understandable. But Enoch warns that fear can make a person spiritually vulnerable to the wrong kind of reading. This is why the heavens chamber is so pastorally important. It is not merely a list of strange ancient arts. It is a warning about what human fear does when it tries to turn creation into a guarantee. The stars become calculators of fate. The clouds become coded omens. The sun becomes a system. The moon becomes a map of control. The earth becomes a surface full of signs to be exploited. The human heart ceases to rest as creature and begins to labor as would-be manager of mysteries. And, let us be honest, that temptation has not vanished. Modern people may not speak the same language as ancient astrologers, but the appetite remains recognizable. We still hunger for systems that promise predictive safety. We still reach for diagrams that make uncertainty seem conquerable. We still want to believe that with enough data, enough patterns, enough interpretive power, we can finally stand above the fragility of life. The Enochic witness answers that hunger with suspicion. Not suspicion of order. Suspicion of grasping. Not suspicion of the heavens. Suspicion of illicit mastery. There is also something profoundly beautiful in the way the list is arranged here. Notice how it moves. Astrology, constellations, clouds, signs of the earth, signs of the sun, course of the moon. It is almost as if the page is sweeping from broad celestial interpretation into more particular regions of order. The sequence itself feels curricular. One could almost imagine an ancient scribe recognizing in it the structure of a fallen school. That is another reason the passage feels so unnerving. It suggests not scattered tricks, but pedagogy. The Watchers are not random corruptors. They are teachers building a world of disordered attention. And that world has consequences. Once people begin to seek power in the reading of signs rather than dependence upon God, imagination changes, time changes, decision-making changes, fear changes, worship changes. A person no longer simply lives beneath heaven. A person begins trying to harvest heaven. That is why this chamber belongs at the center of the script. The corruption of the sky completes the earlier corruptions of body and hidden arts. Asael altered matter and appearance. Semjaza and Armaros altered hidden leverage. Now these teachers alter perception itself. They change the way human beings look at the world overhead and underfoot. They offer a universe that can be decoded, managed, and turned toward human appetite. No wonder the old witness places such gravity on these names. Barakijal, Kokabel, Ezekiel, Arakiel, Shamsiel, Sariel. Each one carries not just a role, but a wound in the human relation to creation. And Pastor Michael's observation tonight is simple. When wonder is no longer allowed to remain wonder, it soon becomes technique. And when technique takes over the heavens, the soul loses one of its oldest refuges. The night sky is meant, in holy order, to make a human being feel small, held, instructed in humility. But once the heavens are turned into instruments of anxious control, even the stars become one more burden laid upon the mind. That may be why this old passage still feels so alive. It knows that a tired human being can be tempted to abuse signs precisely because the heart is afraid of uncertainty. It knows that the desire to read everything may hide a refusal to trust. And it knows that some teachings are corrupt not because they lack sophistication, but because they intensify the creature's rebellion against dependence. There is another reason these heavenly teachings feel so grave in the old witness. They threaten one of the gentlest relationships a human being can have with creation. The relationship of being instructed by what is beautiful without trying to dominate it. A night sky can steady a troubled soul, precisely because it does not answer to us. The stars remain beyond the hand. The moon keeps its course without asking our permission. Clouds gather and dissolve in patterns we may observe but cannot own. The earth bears signs of season and soil and weather, yet still remains creaturely rather than captive. In holy order, those realities teach humility. They remind the human creature that the world is meaningful without being manageable. But once forbidden teachers enter the scene, meaning becomes temptation. The signs above and below are no longer received as invitations to praise. They become potential instruments for anxiety, prediction, self-protection, and advantage. The soul ceases to look upward as a worshipper and begins looking upward as an extractor. That is a devastating change. It turns the cosmos from sanctuary into inventory. This is why I think the old text clusters these names so carefully. Barakijal, Kokabel, Ezekiel, Arakiel, Shamsiel, Sariel. Together they form more than a list of specialties. They form a school of restless reading. They teach humanity how to stare at the world until the world becomes a system of usable signs. And once life becomes only a field of signs to be used, reverence begins to thin. Wonder becomes labor. Beauty becomes data. The night sky becomes one more burden laid upon the mind rather than one more mercy given to the heart. I find that especially striking because so many weary people already live this way without naming it. They look at every shift in circumstance as if it must contain a hidden code for securing the future. They read patterns, not to adore providence, but to escape vulnerability. They keep searching for one more layer of interpretation that will finally remove surprise from life. Enoch's warning is therefore not remote. It is intimate. The corrupt teachers of the heavens still tempt the soul whenever the soul tries to turn created order into guaranteed control. And perhaps that is why this chamber must not end in fear, but in correction. The stars may still be stars. The moon may still be moon. The clouds may still pass in holy freedom. The earth may still be earth. The corruption lies not in their being, but in the rebellious appetite that would rather possess their meanings than receive their witness with gratitude. And maybe that is the most pastoral line hidden in this part of the list. When the heavens are received rightly, they calm us by reminding us we are creatures. When they are misread under rebellious hunger, they burden us by suggesting we must become masters. Wonder was meant to bow the heart before God, not train the mind to squeeze certainty out of every shining thing. These teachers reverse that order. They turn awe into appetite, and appetite into method. That reversal is the true wound hiding inside the sky. So let this chamber close with the sky still above us, not conquered, not decoded, not flattened into systems. Only witnessed. The names have been spoken. The arts have been traced. And now another question rises, almost inevitably. What do we do with the rest of the list? Because not every name in the row receives a surviving exact gift in the same way. Some names stand in sharper light. Others remain shadowed. And the shadow itself is not a problem to be solved too quickly. It is part of the archive, so the next chamber must become a chamber of silence, not empty silence. Textual silence. The silence around the remaining names. The silence that protects the witness from our impatience. The silence that reminds us that a preserved register can still be uneven without becoming untrue. Every serious manuscript study eventually reaches this kind of room. A room where the page has already spoken clearly in some places, but now begins to resist the reader's hunger for perfect symmetry. A room where the mind wants one more chart, one more complete mapping, one more elegant solution. But the witness itself slows the hand and says, "No, not here, not that quickly. Not with this degree of certainty." That is the exact question in this chamber. What are we to do with the remaining watcher names when the text preserves them in the leadership list, but does not attach surviving exact forbidden gifts to each one with equal clarity in the immediate chapters before us? This question matters because it is the place where a careful script becomes more trustworthy than an overconfident one. Many modern retellings flatten the Watcher's tradition into a perfect chart. Every name matched to one neat domain, every silence filled, every uncertainty erased. It is satisfying. It is also often more confident than the old witness itself. The manuscript first path is harder, but better. So let us name some of the remaining figures again, not as failed data points, but as preserved presences within an uneven archive. Batarel, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsapil, Satarel, Turel, Jomjael, and with them the others whose names live in the Rao even when their attached arts do not stand before us as sharply in the same immediate sequence. What does their presence accomplish? First, it keeps the rebellion communal. The named assignments earlier in the passage might tempt us to focus only on the most vivid figures: Asael, Semjaza, Barakijal, Kokabel, and the others more clearly linked with specific teachings. But the remaining names refuse that narrowing. They tell us the company was larger than the surviving portfolio of exact assignments. That matters morally. Not every leader in a corrupt structure will leave behind a single memorable trademark. Some participate in ways that are administratively real, spiritually weighty, and textually preserved, even if the surviving witness does not spotlight their function with the same precision in the immediate frame. Second, the remaining names preserve the texture of transmission itself. Ancient literature is rarely as evenly lit as modern readers wish. Some lines burn bright because later chapters, surviving translations, or memorable teaching clusters keep them near the surface of communal memory. Others remain dimmer, not because they were unimportant, but because manuscript survival is not identical to modern database completeness. A list may endure better than a commentary. A name may remain where an attached explanation grows thin. That is not failure. That is history. And here Pastor Michael should speak with low confidence rather than inflated certainty. We are not embarrassed by the silence of the text. We are instructed by it. Sacred study becomes dishonest the moment it tries to sound more complete than the witness it serves. This is why the remaining names deserve a chamber of their own. Silence is not the same thing as emptiness. Silence can be a real kind of preservation. A name without a surviving exact art still tells us that the tradition wished the name to stand. It still tells us there was a row. It still tells us there were more heads in the company than the most quotable assignments alone would suggest. Take Jomjael, for example, or Turel, or Satarel. Modern readers often meet such names with frustration because the immediate explanatory yield feels low. Yet the archive may be teaching something subtler. It may be reminding us that leadership in evil is not always remembered by the clean lines later readers prefer. Some names remain as moral witnesses without becoming easy symbols. They stand in the register like pillars in shadow, and shadow has its own authority. A pillar half seen is still load-bearing. There is also a profound anti-sensational mercy here. If every name came to us with a full attached art, a full biography, a full occult profile, modern appetite would likely consume the list in precisely the wrong spirit. It would become collectible, cataloged, traded as fascination. But the unevenness of the witness prevents that. It frustrates curiosity just enough to protect reverence. It says, you may know the row, but you may not own the whole chamber. That is a wise burden. It is also deeply Ethiopian, in the best sense of manuscript custody. Difficult texts often survive best when communities keep them as witnesses rather than as entertainment. A preserved silence can be as morally valuable as a preserved explanation, because silence disciplines the reader. Silence prevents the soul from turning dangerous material into a toy. Now, we should be very clear about what this chamber is not doing. It is not denying that later traditions, variant discussions, or related passages may preserve additional associations. Nor is it claiming that no scholarly work can be done with linguistic proposals, textual variants, or wider Enochic developments. It is simply insisting that tonight's primary rail must remain faithful to what the old witness in these central chapters gives plainly and what it does not give plainly. That is the title faithful caution. Exact where exactness survives. Quiet where the page grows quiet. We have already seen that Chapter 7 gives collective corruptions. Chapter 8 gives certain named assignments. The remaining names in the list, therefore, stand as part of a preserved leadership body, even when the immediate pairing of name and gift is not equally explicit for each one. That asymmetry should not be hidden. It should be narrated, and there is a pastoral reason to narrate it. Many exhausted minds believe peace comes from total explanatory possession. If I could just know every angle, every reason, every name, every function, then perhaps uncertainty would loosen its grip. But sacred reading often teaches the opposite. Peace comes not from owning every silence, but from learning to stop violating the silence just because it exists. This chamber, then, becomes unexpectedly merciful. It tells the listener that one may remain close to a preserved text without forcing it to satisfy every demand. It tells the listener that gaps do not always cancel truth. It tells the listener that incompleteness is not the same thing as unreliability. And that last line matters very much for manuscript work. The Book of Enoch, like many ancient texts, comes to us through layered transmission. The full work survives in Ethiopic. Earlier Aramaic fragments and Greek remains illuminate parts of the larger tradition, but do not eliminate all questions. So when the list of leaders feels fuller than the list of exact attached arts, we are experiencing not a scandal, but the honest texture of how ancient witness survives. Let us dwell with that texture for a little while. Batarel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsapil, Satarel, Turel, Jomyael. These names do not vanish just because the immediate explanatory beam falls elsewhere. They remain, and remaining matters. In an archive, to remain is already a form of testimony. A preserved name says, "Do not reduce this company to only the figures your generation finds easiest to repeat." That is one of the quiet strengths of the list. It resists selection bias. It reminds us that the corruption of the world is often larger than the handful of dramatic examples later memory prefers. The row is wider than the highlight reel. There is also, I think, a human humility in speaking names we cannot fully map. We do this in life more often than we admit. We know people partly. We inherit histories unevenly. We receive fragments of family memory, broken testimonies, names with missing stories, warnings without all the details. Yet those fragments still shape conscience. They still train restraint. The remaining Watcher names work somewhat like that. They stand before us as preserved moral data, even when the immediate interpretive yield is spare. So, the silence of the text should not embarrass the script. It should strengthen it. It allows Pastor Michael to sound like a true keeper of manuscripts rather than a seller of certainty. It allows the listener to feel that old study is not manipulation. It allows the channel itself to differentiate from sensational retellings. Most importantly, it keeps the title honest. The angels and their exact forbidden gifts must become, in the body of the script, a disciplined phrase. It means that we will trace exact pairings where the witness gives them. It also means we will acknowledge when the wider leadership list outlasts the surviving clarity of those pairings. That is not weakness. That is literary and spiritual integrity. And perhaps this chamber carries another quiet lesson. Evil often wants spectacle, but the record of evil often survives in uneven rows, partial exposures, damaged ledgers, and names that stand under silence. The silence does not glorify them. It diminishes them. It leaves them there as part of a broken company, not as fully narrated stars, I find that fitting, because rebellion deserves neither total glamour nor total explanatory satisfaction. It deserves exposure enough to warn, exposure enough to humble, exposure enough to keep the soul from repeating its appetite, and that is exactly what the archive gives. We should also notice how the silence around these names changes the sound of the list itself. Once the obvious pairings have been heard, the remaining names no longer function as easy data. They function as restraint. They keep the reader from acting as though the archive were a machine built to answer every question on demand. In that sense, the unnamed functions are almost as important as the named ones. They produce reverent limitation, and limitation is not the enemy of sacred study. It is often its guardian. A person who has never learned to stop at the edge of a witness will soon begin speaking beyond the witness. That is exactly what a manuscript-first script must refuse. Better a careful room with some unresolved shadows than a bright room built from invented certainty. The remaining names therefore become a discipline for the listener. Batarel remains, Ananel remains, Zachiel remains, Samsapil remains, Satarel remains, Turel remains, Jomyael remains. They remain without needing to satisfy us in the same way. They remain as part of a register whose very incompleteness protects it from casual possession. If everything were equally explained, we might leave the study entertained. Because it is not equally explained, we leave chastened. There is also a strange dignity in a name surviving beyond its surviving explanation. Human memory works that way too. Families preserve names long after details are gone. Churches remember saints, elders, martyrs, grandparents in fragments. Sometimes a name outlasts its full story. Yet the name still carries weight. The name still tells us someone stood there, someone mattered there, someone belonged to that row of memory. The remaining watcher names work like that, though in a darker register. They tell us the company was larger than our clearest commentary. They remind us that not every participant in corruption receives equal narrative illumination. That, too, feels morally apt. In human history, some agents of ruin become famous. Others remain half hidden in bureaucratic shade, structurally important but narratively dim. The old list preserves that feeling. A rebellion can be real, organized, and devastating, even when not every actor is equally legible to later generations. The shadows do not make the structure less serious. They make it more believable. So if the listener feels a small frustration here, that frustration may actually be part of the medicine. It teaches us to let the text be older than our appetite. It teaches us not to punish a witness for refusing to become a modern chart. It teaches us that preserved names need not be inflated into embellished biographies to matter. Sometimes a name in shadow is enough to tell the truth. We should therefore resist the modern urge to rescue every shadow with speculation. Speculation can feel respectful, but often it is only impatience dressed in scholarship. The wiser response is to let the remaining names stand where the witness has left them, present, weighty, preserved, and not fully opened. The silence also keeps the script morally clean. Once a writer begins assigning exact roles where the witness has not assigned them, the script stops serving the archive and starts serving its own appetite for completeness. That may feel satisfying in the moment, but it weakens trust. Better to keep the old names standing in partial shadow than to drag them into a false light. Better to let the remaining row teach humility than to turn manuscript restraint into decorative confidence. A damaged register can still tell the truth. It simply tells it with enough roughness to keep us from pretending we stand above the page instead of beneath it as grateful, limited readers. Silence, then, is not a missing gift handed to reckless imagination for completion. It is a boundary. It says the reader may stand near the witness, may honor the names, may learn the row, but may not trespass beyond what has truly been carried forward into the surviving text with confidence, patience, and restraint. No, the next chamber must ask a different question altogether. If the row survives in this uneven but powerful way, how did it survive at all? How did such a difficult list, attached to such difficult teachings, pass through centuries without disappearing entirely? Why do we still have a full Book of Enoch to open, when so much of the ancient world has gone dark around it? That answer leads us out of the immediate list and into the witness that carried the whole book forward. Out of the names, into preservation, into Ge'ez, into Ethiopia, into the patient custody of a text too morally heavy to survive by accident alone. Now we enters one of its most important manuscript chambers, not because we are leaving the watchers behind, but because we are asking the question every careful listener should ask once the names and the teachings have been opened. How did this witness survive long enough to reach us at all? The exact question here is simple. What did the Ethiopic, or Ge'ez, witness preserve for the Book of Enoch? And why does that matter specifically for tonight's study of the Watcher names and their forbidden gifts? The answer begins with a historical fact that is almost astonishing in its quietness. The full text of 1 Enoch survives only in Ethiopic, in Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church. Portions of the wider Enochic tradition survive in Aramaic fragments from Qumran. Remnants of Greek translation also survive. These are immensely important witnesses. But when it comes to the complete book, the ancient river that carried it whole runs through Ethiopia. That means something profound for the mood of this script. We are not opening a text that simply floated untouched from the Second Temple world into our hands. We are opening a text that lived through transmission, translation, liturgy, copying, custody, and Christian reception in a particular ecclesial home. The witness is ancient, but it is also carried. It is old, but not ownerless, and Pastor Michael should make that point with both gratitude and restraint. Gratitude, because without Ethiopic preservation, the full shape of Enoch would not stand before us in the same way. Restraint, because scholars rightly caution that the extant Ethiopic text is not a magical time capsule bypassing every historical complexity. The work is composite. Its parts likely arose over time in Hebrew and/or Aramaic contexts, later entered Greek, and then were translated into Ge'ez. The Ethiopic witness is therefore precious and indispensable, but it is also part of transmission history rather than an escape from it. That tension is not a problem. It is the beauty of manuscript truth. The text survives through real communities, real languages, real centuries, real copying hands, real liturgical memory. And because that is true, the Book of Enoch comes to us with both authority and texture. This matters especially for tonight's title. When we study the Watcher names, the leadership list, and the forbidden teachings in 1 Enoch 6:8, we are not reading a modern reconstruction invented to satisfy fascination with fallen angels. We are reading a preserved witness whose full literary body endured in Gaz manuscripts and Ethiopian ecclesial custody. The names remain because the book remained. The book remained because a tradition held it. There is a deeply moving pastoral note hidden there. Communities often preserve what later generations might have considered too difficult, too strange, or too morally unsettling for casual use. And yet Ethiopia kept Enoch within living memory. That does not mean every modern claim about Enoch is automatically sound. It does mean the witness itself was not discarded as an embarrassment. It was copied, read, and received. That is a form of patience modern culture rarely understands. We tend to preserve what is immediately useful, marketable, or easy to summarize. The Ethiopian witness preserves something heavier than that. It preserved a text that warns, complicates, humbles, and resists simplification. And perhaps that is why the Watcher's List feels so appropriate to this manuscript chamber. A difficult list needs a patient tradition, uneven names, morally charged teachings, layered transmission, and the need for interpretive caution. All of that belongs naturally in a custodial world where the text is carried with seriousness rather than consumed for novelty. There is also the matter of survival itself. Scholars have noted that the complete text survives in Ethiopic manuscripts whose extant copies are much later than the earliest stages of the book's composition. That can sound disappointing to the impatient reader, but it should not be. Ancient textual work always involves witnesses, distances, comparison, and humility. What matters tonight is that the Ethiopic stream is not a minor footnote. It is the major vessel through which the whole book reaches us. That is why Ge'ez deserves to be named early and often in a manuscript-first script. Ge'ez is not decorative atmosphere. It is the house key, the language of custody, the language through which the full Enochic witness remained open. And the image of custody matters here. I want the listener to feel that the Book of Enoch was not preserved by abstraction. It was preserved by practices, by copying, by reading, by ecclesial memory, by communities who, whatever else may be said historically, did not let the book vanish. That means tonight's archive table stretches farther than Hermon. It stretches into scriptoria, monasteries, churches, libraries, mountain custody, liturgical continuity, and the long patience of a tradition that kept difficult pages alive. This is where the Ethiopian angle becomes emotionally alive without becoming sentimental. We are not praising Ethiopia vaguely. We are recognizing a concrete manuscript fact with reverence. The full Book of Enoch survives in Ethiopic. Therefore, the Watcher List survives in a form we can still hear. Therefore, the names still stand in a row. Therefore, the forbidden arts can still be traced in the old witness. Therefore, the very difficulty of the text can still discipline us. And I confess that I find that beautiful. Because one of the saddest habits of modern reading is the assumption that difficult inheritance has little value. If a text is complex, morally demanding, or textually uneven, many people lose patience with it. But manuscript history often works the opposite way. What survives longest is not always what is easiest. Sometimes what survives longest is what a patient tradition loved enough to keep despite difficulty. That is what this chamber wants the listener to feel. The Watcher's story did not survive merely because it is dramatic. It survived because it was held. Held in language, held in copying, held in church memory, held in Ethiopian custody. There is also a theological lesson here. Preservation itself can be a kind of witness. Not proof of every modern speculation, not permission for reckless conclusions, but witness. The survival of Enoch in Gaze tells us that sacred memory can endure in places the wider world learns too late to honor. It tells us that canon conversations are not the whole of preservation conversations. It tells us that what one tradition carried patiently may later become a source of serious reflection for many others. And for this script, the lesson is very specific. If we want to speak of the Watcher names with integrity, we must honor the stream that kept the full page before us. So tonight Ge'ez should be felt not as an exotic flourish, but as a manuscript shelter. A shelter where names, warnings, and troubling teachings remained legible across time. No, before we leave this chamber, we should hold the scholarly caution and the pastoral gratitude together, not against each other. Scholars remind us that one Enoch is composite, that the Ethiopic witness comes through layered transmission, that extant manuscripts are later than the earliest composition, and that textual reconstruction must proceed carefully. Good. That caution protects us from naivete. At the same time, the complete book survives in Ethiopic. Good. That fact protects us from ingratitude. Both truths belong together. The text is precious. The text is transmitted. The text survives. The text requires humility. That is exactly the right atmosphere for a manuscript first night study. There is another way to say this, and it belongs very naturally to Pastor Michael's voice. Ethiopia did not merely preserve a curiosity, it preserved a burden. The Book of Enoch is not an easy book to keep near. It complicates neat assumptions. It opens old wounds about judgment, rebellion, forbidden knowledge, cosmic order, and the moral fragility of human civilization. Many traditions might easily have let such a text fade to the margins of practical memory. Yet the Ethiopic witness kept it available. That availability matters because it changes the scale of our gratitude. We are not grateful only that a dramatic story survived. We are grateful that a difficult warning survived. The watcher names remained legible because the whole literary chamber remained open. The teachings remained traceable because the larger witness was not buried. And all of that means tonight's study takes place inside someone else's patience. We are reading under the shelter of transmitted devotion. I think listeners should feel that almost physically. Not sentimentally, but physically. Imagine a manuscript copied because someone believed the hard books also belonged in the house of memory. Imagine pages handled with enough care that a text both strange and searching did not disappear. Imagine generations willing to keep what later readers would struggle to classify. That is not accidental survival. That is custodial love shaped by reverence. And the effect of that preservation is more than academic. It changes how we speak. It makes the tone slower. It forbids mockery. It prevents us from treating gaze as decorative atmosphere around a sensational topic. Gaze is the medium of survival here. Ethiopian custody is the reason the complete witness still lies before the modern reader. Once that is understood, the whole script acquires a different gravity. We are no longer consumers of an ancient rumor. We are guests in a preserved tradition. There is even a kind of moral symmetry in that. The watcher's story warns against receiving powerful knowledge from the wrong hands. The Ethiopic witness, by contrast, shows what it looks like for difficult knowledge to be carried by patient hands. One transmission wounds, the other preserves. One teaches restless grasping, the other teaches custody. One deforms the human relation to creation, the other protects the human relation to memory. That contrast is quietly beautiful. So, when this chamber speaks of Ge'ez and Ethiopia, it should do more than provide background. It should steady the listener. It should remind the listener that even in a world where corruption can spread through teaching, truth can also survive through teaching. Even in a world where names of rebellion are preserved, the means of preservation can still be holy. The same human act of transmission can wound or heal depending on allegiance. That is one of the deepest manuscript lessons in the whole script, and perhaps this is why the preservation chamber belongs before the vulnerability chamber in the larger script. The listener must first feel that the text has come through faithful custody, not through sensational rediscovery alone. Only then will the moral weight of the watcher names land with the right kind of sobriety. And that patient custody offers a needed contrast to the watchers themselves. They transmitted dangerous knowledge downward in rebellion. The Ethiopic witness transmitted a difficult warning forward in faithfulness. One act of teaching damaged the world. The other act of teaching helped preserve a text capable of warning the world. That contrast should steady the listener. It reminds us that transmission is never neutral. Hands can pass along ruin, or hands can pass along a witness against ruin. Ethiopia's preservation of Enoch, therefore, belongs inside the moral drama of the script, not outside it. The means of survival, matter almost as much as the fact of survival itself for this manuscript first night. That is why manuscript gratitude must accompany manuscript caution. We do not honor Ethiopia by pretending transmission is simple. We honor Ethiopia by telling the truth. This witness was carried faithfully enough to remain indispensable, and carefully enough to keep inviting both reverence and disciplined comparison from every later serious reader who approaches it. And it prepares us for the next move in the script. Once we understand what Ethiopia preserved, we can ask the moral question more deeply. Why do these forbidden gifts keep looking useful, elegant, predictive, or desirable to the human heart? Why does corrupted knowledge so often arrive dressed as advantage? That is where the next chamber will turn. But for now, let the preservation itself become part of the comfort. Not a soft comfort, a steady one. The kind that comes from knowing the page was not lost. The kind that comes from knowing difficult truth can be carried across centuries. The kind that comes from picturing an old witness still lying open under the care of hands that did not let it disappear. The names remain. The list remains. The warnings remain. And through Ge'ez, through Ethiopia, through preservation patient enough to outlive forgetfulness, the witness remains available for one more night of careful reading. Now we arrive at the chamber where the text turns inward toward the human heart. Up to this point, we have opened the leadership row, listened to the names, traced the most explicit pairings of teacher and corrupting art, and paused to honor both the silences of the archive and the Ethiopian witness that carried the full text forward. But all of that research now asks one unavoidable question. Why did these gifts take hold? Why do forbidden gifts so rarely arrive looking filthy at first glance? Why do they so often appear useful, elegant, protective, illuminating, or desirable? That is the exact question of this chamber. And if we answer it honestly, the Watcher's story becomes far more searching than a simple tale of ancient rebellion. It becomes a mirror for the old vulnerability of the human creature. We are not only wounded by what is obviously monstrous, we are often wounded most deeply by what seems helpful before it is holy, effective before it is wise, beautiful before it is clean, or predictive before it is obedient. That is why the forbidden gifts in Enoch have such disturbing realism. Weapons promise safety. Armor promises preparedness. Metalwork promises progress. Adornment promises desirability. Cosmetic enhancement promises stronger presence. Enchantments promise leverage. Root cuttings promise access to hidden powers. The resolving of enchantments promises management of what has already been disturbed. Astrology promises orientation. Constellations promise a map. Cloud knowledge promises anticipation. The signs of the earth promise readable patterns. The signs of the sun and the course of the moon promise timing and control. Nothing in that list first appears to the human imagination under the label danger. That is the point. The old witness is not merely cataloging strange arts. It is exposing the way corruption enters through appetite disguised as advantage. The gifts are dangerous precisely because they appeal to genuine human vulnerabilities. Fear, vanity, uncertainty, longing for mastery, hunger for beauty, terror of surprise, desire to be armed against pain, desire to know what comes next, desire to secure the self before the future arrives. And here, Pastor Michael must speak with plain warmth. A tired soul can be tempted by usefulness more quickly than by wickedness. Wickedness still knows how to dress itself. It does not always come wearing ugliness. It often comes wearing competence. That line matters tonight, because many people think they would recognize corruption easily if it ever appeared close to them. They imagine evil as immediate revulsion. But Enoch's realism is sharper than that. Evil often enters as improved capability. It enters as polished technique. It enters as one more layer of control added to a frightened life. It enters as the suggestion that if you can just learn enough, sharpen enough, refine enough, read enough, decorate enough, predict enough, then perhaps vulnerability itself will loosen its grip on you. That is the lie beneath the gifts. Not simply be wicked, but be less vulnerable, be less dependent, be less creaturely. And because those desires strike so close to the bone of human fear, the gifts spread. This is one reason the Asael chamber was so sobering. The forge and the mirror work because human beings want both protection and presentation. They want to survive the world, and they want to appear well inside it. They want force if threatened and beauty if seen. The old text recognizes that these desires can be bent, intensified, and disordered by rebellious instruction. The same is true of the heavenly teachings. People do not seek illicit readings of signs only out of idle fascination. Often they seek them because uncertainty hurts. A heart afraid of tomorrow will pay dearly for the illusion that tomorrow can be decoded. And this is where the vulnerability break belongs. Some truths survive quietly because the world prefers brighter lies. Some warnings remain hidden in old pages because we do not really want to hear them until life has tired us enough to listen. And some forms of corruption wound us most effectively because they arrive carrying a promise we have secretly prayed for. You will not have to wait. You will not have to trust. You will not have to remain exposed. Here is a shortcut to certainty. Here is a craft that will steady you. Here is a layer of skill that will keep you from being overlooked, surprised, or powerless again. I think many weary people know what that feels like. Not because they are fascinated with ancient angels, but because they know how strong the urge can be to stop feeling defenseless, to stop being overlooked, to stop living with unanswered questions, to stop letting mystery remain mystery. And this is why the Watcher's tradition matters pastorally. It names a temptation so old that it still breathes in modern life. The temptation to solve existential fragility by receiving power from the wrong hands. That is what makes the gifts forbidden. Not only their content, their source, their posture, their moral direction, their promise of life without creaturely dependence. This is where the language of usefulness must be handled carefully. The old witness is not teaching that every craft is evil, every adornment evil, every observation of nature evil, every knowledge of created things evil. Scripture itself contains holy craftsmanship, ordered calendars, medicinal care, beautiful garments, wise agricultural knowledge, and reverent observation of creation. The issue in Enoch is not usefulness as such. The issue is knowledge received in rebellion and bent toward self-exaltation, manipulation, vanity, violence, and the refusal of holy limits. That distinction keeps the chamber sane. It keeps the script from becoming reactionary. It also keeps it truthful, because corruption is rarely detected simply by the outer form of a thing. It is detected by allegiance and use. A beautiful thing can become disordered. A useful thing can become dehumanizing. A powerful thing can become unclean. The question is never only, does it work? The deeper question is, what is it making of the soul that trusts it? And that may be the most important line in this entire chamber. What is it making of the soul? A weapon may make the hand feel stronger. An ornament may make the body feel more significant. A predictive system may make the mind feel safer. An enchantment may make the anxious heart feel less helpless. But what kind of person is being formed beneath that feeling? Enoch answers with severity. Forbidden gifts do not merely extend human capability. They deform human relation to God, to creation, to the body, to time, to fear, and to one another. They promise empowerment, While quietly dissolving reverence, there is also a sorrowful consistency in the list. Every gift in some way reduces waiting. Weapons reduce the need to remain vulnerable before threat. Beautified surfaces reduce the need to remain unedited before the gaze of others. Enchantments reduce the need to endure uncertainty. Celestial and terrestrial sign reading reduce the need to live with unmastered time. Again and again the gifts whisper, "You may become more than creaturely. You may move past dependence." But the biblical imagination, and the Enochic witness within its wider world, says something radically different. Creatureliness is not an insult. Dependence is not a defect. Mystery is not always an emergency. The soul becomes most unstable when it begins treating holy limits as wounds rather than gifts. This is why the title phrase "forbidden gifts" is so strong. A gift normally implies blessing, welcome, fit relation, and gratitude. A forbidden gift is a contradiction in terms. It is something offered in the form of benefit, but carrying the structure of damage. It mimics generosity while violating order. It looks like enlargement while breeding corruption. And the human heart has always been vulnerable to that kind of offering. Perhaps because the heart is so often tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of not knowing. Tired of feeling weak. Tired of being seen incompletely. Tired of the future arriving without permission. So the gifts do not merely tempt pride, they tempt exhaustion. That, to me, is one of the deepest kindnesses in this old text. It does not only condemn, it reveals. It shows us why the offer lands. It shows us why humanity listens. It shows us that corruption often enters not through theatrical hatred of God, but through the weary desire to feel safer, stronger, more beautiful, more informed, more defended, more in control. And once you see that, the watcher's story stops being remote. It becomes painfully close. The final observation for this chamber is simple, and I want it to land quietly. The most dangerous teachings are often the ones that attach themselves to legitimate human desires. Desire for beauty, desire for protection, desire for meaning, desire for knowledge, desire for order, desire for survival. The enemy rarely needs to invent wholly alien appetites. He only needs to bend familiar ones out of holy alignment. That is why the old witness remains so useful tonight. It teaches us not to distrust desire itself, but to examine the hand from which fulfillment is being offered. Useful is not the same as good. Beautiful is not the same as holy. Predictive is not the same as wise. Powerful is not the same as clean. And once the soul learns that distinction, some of the glitter begins to dim. That is a mercy. A stern mercy, yes, but mercy nonetheless. There is another reason these gifts looked persuasive. They arrived wrapped in speed. Obedience is usually slow. It asks for waiting, blessing, measure, season, boundary, and ripeness. Corruption offers a shortcut. It whispers that what is meant to be received can be seized, and what is meant to be ripened can be accelerated. Much of temptation is not a love of ugliness in its final form. It is impatience with creaturely limits. The forbidden gift flatters the soul by promising expansion without purification, access without formation, skill without wisdom, and influence without consecration. In that sense, the Watchers do not merely introduce bad information. They model disordered timing. They hand over powers before holiness, and premature power nearly always bruises the hands that clutch it. That warning is still merciful for weary hearts tonight, even now. And that is why the warning still reaches beyond the ancient hill. The page is not merely telling us that strange beings taught strange arts. It is showing how the heart can mistake usefulness for innocence. A thing may work and still wound. A method may impress and still deform. A promise may glitter and still betray. The listener who learns that distinction has already received a mercy from this chamber. Not a fearful mercy, a clarifying mercy, the kind that slows the hand before grasping, slows the mind before admiring, and slows the soul before calling every bright thing good. Such slowness is not weakness. In the old archive, it is one of the first signs that wisdom has begun to return to a creature again tonight too. Now, the next chamber must gather the whole study into one clear answer. We have heard the names, the assignments, the silences, and the witness of preservation. Before the lamp lowers, we must say plainly what the text lets us know, what it leaves uneven, and what tonight's title finally means under the discipline of the page. Now we come to the title lock. This chamber must do one thing, and do it plainly. It must answer the question the listener carried into the night. What, exactly, can we say with confidence about the Watcher names and their forbidden gifts if we remain faithful to the old witness and do not force the page to be smoother than it is? So let us answer carefully. First, the text of 1 Enoch presents the Watcher rebellion as structured. It is not a vague heavenly disturbance. It is organized, oath-bound, and led. The company descends in the days of Jared, binds itself together on Mount Hermon, and is remembered as arranged under chiefs of tens. That means the old witness wants us to feel the rebellion as ordered transgression rather than as random spiritual chaos. Second, the text gives us a preserved leadership list. The names are not left in faceless anonymity. Semjaza stands at the head, followed by the row of leaders whose names survive in the register. The very existence of that row matters. It tells us corruption entered the world through identifiable leadership, remembered in sequence. Third, the list itself carries textual strain. The phrase chiefs of tens gestures toward a count that many readers naturally hear as 20. Yet in familiar rendered forms of the passage, the preserved list often feels one name short when counted on the page. This is not a reason to mock the witness. It is one of tonight's most important clues. It tells us we are reading a transmitted archive, not a modern infographic. The count bears pressure. The pressure belongs to the truth of manuscript survival. Fourth, the text distinguishes between collective corruptions and named assignments. Chapter 7 gives company-wide corruption. The Watchers together teach charms, enchantments, root cuttings, and acquaintance with plants. Chapter 8 then narrows the beam, giving more exact, attached roles to certain named figures. This distinction must remain intact if the title is to remain honest. Fifth, some pairings are explicit enough to state clearly. Asael, or Azazel, is associated with weapons, metalworking, armor, ornament, antimony, beautified eyelids, costly stones, and coloring substances. Semjaza is linked with enchantments and root cuttings. Armoros is linked with the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal is linked with astrology. Kokabel with the constellations. Ezekiel with the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel with the signs of the earth. Shamsiel with the signs of the sun. Sariel with the course of the moon. Those pairings form the strongest, title-faithful core of the study. Sixth, the remaining names in the leadership row still matter, even where the immediate chapters do not attach surviving exact arts to each one with equal clarity. Batarel, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsapil, Satarel, Turel, Jomjael, and the others do not become unimportant because the explanatory light falls elsewhere. Their preserved presence keeps the rebellion communal and prevents us from reducing the whole event to only the most famous figures. The silence around some of them is part of the archive and must be narrated as such. Seventh, the Ethiopian witness is indispensable to this study. The full text of 1 Enoch survives in Ethiopic. In Ge'ez, Aramaic fragments and Greek remains are crucial witnesses to parts of the tradition, but without Ethiopic preservation, we would not have the full literary body of the book in the way we do. At the same time, scholarly caution remains necessary. The text comes through layered transmission and must be handled with humility. Gratitude and restraint belong together. Now let us speak the answer in one sentence, simple enough to carry into the dark. Tonight we have not discovered a perfect modern chart of 20 names and 20 equally explicit gifts. We have discovered something older and more truthful. We have opened a preserved watcher list whose very count bears strain, and we have traced the forbidden arts that the witness does attach clearly to certain names, while honoring the places where the row survives more fully than the exact pairings do. That is the answer, and in some ways it is a better answer than a flawless chart would have been. Why? Because it gives us the texture of real witness. A structured rebellion, a named row, a troubled count, a cluster of explicit teachings, a larger company standing partly in silence. A full book carried through Ge'ez preservation, and a moral warning stronger because it was not cleaned up for our convenience. This is the title lock sentence for tonight. We have not merely heard the watchers named, we have opened a preserved list whose count itself shows strain, and within that list, we have traced the forbidden gifts the old witness still binds clearly to certain names. Let that sentence settle, because once it settles, the listener no longer needs to strain for novelty. The manuscript has already done its work. The line has opened. The hidden detail has been given. The page has answered as much as it came to answer. And perhaps the deepest answer is not even about the watchers alone. Perhaps it is this. Dangerous knowledge often survives in history by attaching itself to human fear and desire. But truthful warning survives by attaching itself to patient witness. That is why the old text still matters. It does not simply tell us that rebellion happened. It tells us how rebellion taught, how corruption spread, how names were remembered, and how a difficult witness remained in custody long enough to warn one more generation. So before we move toward rest, let us set the final conclusions in gentle order. The Watchers were not faceless. Their rebellion was not chaotic. Their gifts were not harmless. Their teachings were not all equally mapped, but neither were they merely vague. The old witness is exact in some places, collective in others, and silent in others still. That unevenness is not weakness. It is part of the honesty of the archive, and the Ethiopian witness matters because it kept the page open. That is enough for tonight. More than enough, perhaps. The line is open now. We do not need to press it further. The names have been spoken with care. The gifts have been weighed without glamour. The silences have been honored. The witness has been received. And now the manuscript itself seems to ask for a different kind of faithfulness. Not more analysis. Not one more chart. Not one more anxious attempt to own every remaining shadow. Only the humility to let a preserved page remain a preserved page. Only the gratitude to step back from the table without forcing the text to give more than it has given. Only the quietness to carry the warning without carrying the burden of mastery. Sixth, many other names in the leadership row do not receive surviving individual assignments in the same exact way. That silence must be kept. We may name them. We may honor the preserved order. We may note that the rebellion is remembered through them. But we may not honestly attach a separate forbidden specialty to every single leader unless the witness itself does so. Where the page is exact, we should be exact. Where the page is general, we should be general. Where the page falls silent, reverence should become silence too. Seventh, that is why tonight's title must be heard with manuscript discipline. The angels and their exact forbidden gifts, does not mean that each of the chiefs is neatly paired with a surviving modern caption. It means the tradition preserves a leadership list, preserves a cluster of collective corruptions, and preserves a smaller set of named pairings that can still be spoken with confidence. The exactness belongs to those preserved pairings, not to a forced modern completion of the whole row. Eighth, the Ethiopian witness matters here with unusual tenderness. The full text of Enoch survived in Ge'ez, while other witnesses remained partial and scattered. That does not remove every textual question. It does mean we receive tonight's study through a line of preservation that deserves gratitude rather than arrogance. The list reached us because it was copied, guarded, prayed over, and carried. Even the strain in the count reminds us that manuscripts are received inheritances, not frictionless products. Ninth, the moral force of the passage is not curiosity alone. The names matter because memory matters. The gifts matter because corruption often comes clothed as usefulness. And the unevenness matters because the warning itself is part of the teaching. The text lets us know enough to fear theft, enough to distrust seductive brilliance, enough to see how power, detached from obedience, wounds the world, and enough to bow before the places where the witness chooses not to elaborate. So, here is the answer in one plain sentence. The Watcher's tradition remembers an ordered company of rebel leaders, preserves a name row that bears the pressure of a 20-count tradition, assigns exact forbidden arts to a limited set of named figures, describes additional corruptions collectively, and leaves the honest reader with both knowledge and restraint. Truthful summary as pastoral care for tired listeners tonight. There is a reason careful summary belongs at the end of a night script like this. Tired listeners do not need exaggeration. They need truth in right proportion. They need a voice willing to say, here the witness is clear, here the witness is collective, here the witness is strained, and here the witness falls silent. That kind of honesty is not less dramatic only. It is more humane. It refuses to burden the listener with invented certainty. It refuses to trade reverence for neatness. And it lets the final answer do what a faithful answer should do. Close the chamber without closing the mystery. Steady the mind without flattering it. And leave the soul resting under what has actually been preserved, rather than under what was only imagined later. Such restraint is not coldness. It is kindness to the archive, kindness to the text, and kindness to the weary soul who came here for truth, quiet enough to sleep beneath without confusion tonight. That is where this study must end, and that is where rest may begin. The lamp grows lower now. The page has given us what it came to give. The names have been spoken. The old list has been opened. The difficult line has been honored without being forced. And now, there is no more teaching to do tonight. No more gifts to assign. No more names to press. No more effort required from the mind. Let the manuscript rest where it lies. Let it remain open in memory, but no longer under strain. You do not need to carry every name into sleep. You do not need to remember each line in order. You do not need to solve the unfinished edges of the row. The witness remains, even when your hands grow still. So imagine the archive table now, in its late quiet. The study has ended. The ink has stopped asking for attention. The air of the room has softened. Nothing more is being uncovered. Nothing more is being counted. Nothing more is being weighed. Only the low faithfulness of a page that has outlived many nights. Perhaps there is a window somewhere beyond the table, and beyond the window a dark sky untroubled by our need to decode it. Perhaps there is old wood beneath the manuscript, worn by years of use. Perhaps the room itself has learned how to keep secrets without hiding truth. That is the kind of quiet this ending needs. Not forgetfulness, not fear, just release. The names can rest now. The mountain can rest now. The row can rest now. The archive has yielded what it carried through the centuries, and it asks nothing more of you. If one part of the study still lingers, let it linger gently. If one name remains brighter than the others, let it glow and then dim. If one warning remains near your heart, let it remain without becoming labor. Sleep does not require perfect summary. Rest does not require complete possession. The page is still true, even when your thoughts become light. The witness is still there even when you stop holding it actively in mind. And perhaps that is part of the mercy of old texts. They do not need us to keep them alive by effort every moment. They remain. They wait. They keep their place in the dark with a patience our anxious minds rarely manage. So let your own mind become less outlined now. Let the inner counting stop. Let the need to arrange and conclude soften. There is no examination here. No unfinished duty. No demand that you stay watchful over the manuscript. You have already kept faith with the study simply by staying near it. The rest belongs to silence. And silence is not empty tonight. It is full of custody, full of pages laid down, full of lamps lowered, full of old witnesses still keeping their quiet. If you like, imagine the manuscript being covered now, not shut away in rejection, but protected in peace. A cloth drawn gently, a lamp turned lower, a chair pushed back without haste. The room remains kind. The page remains safe. You remain safe to leave it there. The old witness will not vanish because you sleep. The names will not dissolve because your thoughts grow soft. What was preserved before you arrived will remain preserved after your eyes close. That is a restful thought. You were not responsible for holding the whole archive together. You are only invited to rest beside what it preserved. So now the study thins into quiet imagery only. No new lines, no new sources, no new explanations. Only the sense of a room in which truth has been handled carefully and then left in peace. Perhaps the darkness around the table is not heavy now, but gentle. Perhaps the edges of the room are no longer sharp. Perhaps even the old difficult names have softened into the kind of distance that no longer asks anything from you. The page is still there. The line is still there. The witness is still there. And now you may rest beneath what it preserved. Let the mind lie down. Let the inner hand unclench from the need to know. Let the breathing settle into its own quiet measure. Nothing is being taken from you. The truth does not disappear when the room grows dim. The archive does not collapse when you stop thinking about it. It remains. That is enough. More than enough. You do not need to solve the strain in the count tonight. You do not need to smooth the row of names into modern neatness. You do not need to make the old witness flatter, cleaner, or easier than it is. The archive may keep a little roughness. The page may keep its age. The silence may keep its boundary. And you may rest without finishing what the manuscript did not ask you to finish. Let the mountain remain in the distance now. Let Hermon keep its cold air. Let the oath remain sealed in the dark where the ancient story placed it. Let the names lie down one by one like stones set back into an old wall. Semjaza, Asael, Barakijal, Kokabel, Shamsiel, Sariel, not to stir you, not to trouble you, only to let the chamber empty gently, only to let the sounds become softer than thought, only to let the list become less like a problem and more like a fading register in a quiet room. Some listeners reach the end of a study and still feel the reflex to keep working, to keep sorting, to keep comparing translations, to keep tightening every line. But tonight, the kindest thing may be to leave one lamp lit in the archive and walk no farther, because reverence also knows when to stop. Reverence knows when a page has been honored enough for one night. Reverence knows when the hand can unclench. Reverence knows when the mind can become still beside an unanswered edge without fear. If thoughts return, let them return slowly. If a name returns, let it drift through and go. If the old questions return, let them sit at a distance like shelves beyond the circle of light. Nothing more is required of you now. Not study, not mastery, not vigilance. Only rest, only breathing, only the small mercy of being a creature again instead of a keeper of every unresolved thing. The cloth remains over the page. The table remains beneath it. The room remains around it. And somewhere, beyond your effort, the preserved witness remains what it has always been, a carried testimony, older than your fatigue, steadier than your thoughts, quieter than your need to conclude it perfectly. So let the sentences shorten now. Let the edges blur. Let the archive recede. Let the names grow dim. Let the mountain fall behind the hills of sleep. Let the lamp become only warmth. Let the warmth become only hush. And let the hush be enough to carry you the rest of the way. Do not reopen the chamber for one more answer. Do not relight the corridor of questions. Let one closed page remain closed. Let one unfinished edge remain unfinished. Sleep does not require completion. It only requires permission to stop. The witness will still be there tomorrow, if tomorrow is the day for returning. But tonight is for quiet breathing, lowered light, unhurried darkness, and the mercy of enough. Stay here in the final hush, dear friend, and rest now. Stay a little longer in the softened room. Not to study, not to resolve, only to notice how quiet the chamber has become now that the striving has ended. The shelves do not ask anything from you. The covered page does not ask anything from you. The remaining shadows do not ask anything from you. They simply remain, and you may remain with them for a moment, breathing gently until even the names lose their edges and become part of the hush. Let that happen without resistance. Let the archive grow distant. Let the mountain disappear. Let the last careful thought set itself down beside the lamp and rest there. There is no failure in unfinishedness here. There is only trust. The trust that truth can keep its own watch through the night while you sleep beneath it in peace. If a final question still flickers, let it dim without force. If a final concern still circles, let it widen and fade. Nothing holy is lost by resting. Nothing true is threatened by your sleep. The manuscript can remain standing while you lie down in peace tonight. Rest is faithful here tonight too, dear friend. Now, rest safely beneath the preserved words, and let long night hold you gently. The lamp grows lower still. The cloth rests over the page. The table holds its silence. The old witness keeps its quiet, and you may sleep now beside the mercy of what survived. Good night.